The first thing he felt was the cold. Not the kind of cold you feel when you step outside in winter without a jacket, but the kind where your body feels like someone else's, and you don't know where your arms end. Ethan Reed opened his eyes and saw the ceiling. The beam above his head was rotten through, and rainwater was seeping through a crack in the roof, dripping straight onto the dirt floor. He tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't obey him. His arms were skinny, no muscle at all. Calluses on his palms from work he couldn't remember. Everything exploded in his head all at once. Someone else's memories poured in like a flood. Ethan Reed, 20 years old, a country bumpkin from the border town of Cross Hill. His parents had died in the war. No inheritance, no reputation. The whole town knew him as the guy who couldn't even carry a pitcher of water without spilling half of it. He sat up on the bed and looked around. The room wasn't really a room. It was a hall, a long, dark, with rows of wooden bunks along the walls. And from every bunk, eyes were staring at him. 10 pairs of eyes. Children's eyes. Hungry, wary. Not a single one of these children was older than 12. The youngest-looking one appeared to be about 4 years old. She had a burn on her left cheek, an old one. It had healed crookedly. She was standing closest to him, clutching a piece of stale bread in her fist. Ethan looked at her. She looked at him. And at that moment, the door flew open. Standing in the doorway was a man in a city official's uniform, a red face, greasy hair, a paunch hanging over his belt. He leaned inside and slapped a piece of paper right against Ethan's chest. It was Bailiff Bart Calder. He said that Ethan was now the official guardian of this orphanage and all 10 children in it. He said the document had been signed personally by Magistrate Harold Venn. He said that if even one child died before the winter inspection, Ethan would face a tribunal for embezzlement of guardianship funds. Ethan looked at the paper. He looked at Bart. He asked what funds he was talking about. Bart laughed. He said it wasn't his problem anymore. He turned and walked out. The door slammed. It grew quiet. Ethan stood with the paper in his hand in the middle of the dilapidated hall, listening to the wind whistling through the hole in the roof. 10 children were silent. They were used to being silent. They were used to adults coming and going, to promises being worthless, to not having food every day, to warmth being a luxury. A little girl with a burn on her cheek approached him. She held out her piece of bread. She said one word, "Uncle," then a second, "Hungry." Ethan looked at that piece of bread, stale, gray, about half the size of her palm. It was her daily ration, the only food she'd seen all day, and she was giving it to him, to a stranger with empty eyes, because she decided he was hungrier. Ethan's eyes stung, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, and at that moment, a sound rang out in his head, clear, metallic, like the toll of a small bell. Guardian system activated. Condition met. Sincerely accept the child as family. Progress, 1 out of 10. Ethan blinked. A translucent panel appeared before his eyes. The child's name, Emma. Age, 4. Affection, 0. Talent sealed. Status, empty vessel. He closed his eyes, opened them. The panel hadn't disappeared. He rubbed his eyes. The panel remained. At the bottom, a line glowed in small print. Affection scale unlocked. Current level, 0 out of 100. A level of attachment of at least 25 is required to awaken the talent. Attachment grows from acts of sincere care. Insincerity is recognized instantly. Ethan slowly dropped to his knees in front of Emma. He took the bread from her hands. He broke it in half. He gave her the larger piece. He popped the smaller half into his mouth. The bread was hard as a rock. He chewed and thought. In his past life, he'd worked for 12 years as a caregiver at an orphanage in Portland, not out of a sense of calling, because no one else would hire him after the army. He considered himself a failure. Almost 30. No family, no money, no prospects. The only thing he knew how to do was comfort other people's children, fix broken furniture, stretch a meager budget for a month. And here he was, kneeling in a foreign world, in a foreign body, with someone else's memories. And before him were 10 children whom everyone had abandoned. Ethan smiled. He stood up. He dusted off his knees. He looked into 10 pairs of eyes. They were waiting. They were always waiting. Waiting for him to leave, to turn away, to say it was a mistake. Ethan said that now he would go around to each of them. He'd find out their names, see who was sick, who was hungry, who was in pain. And then, together, they'd decide what to do about that hole in the ceiling. The oldest boy, about 12, with a long scar across his eyebrow, snorted. He said the previous caretaker had said the same thing. He lasted 4 days and escaped through the window one night. Ethan asked what his name was. The boy said his name was Ray. Ethan nodded. He said he'd remember. He said he wouldn't run away. Ray turned away. He didn't believe him. Ethan didn't argue. He began his rounds. 10 children, 10 names, 10 stories he would hear later. Right now he saw only numbers. 3 with fevers. 1 had a festering wound on his leg. 2 had ribs sticking out so far you could count them. There was no food at the shelter at all. Not a crumb, not a crust. Their water supply was a bucket of rainwater collected from under the leaky roof. Enough firewood for 1 night. 4 blankets for 10 people. Ethan finished his rounds and sat down against the wall. The system displayed a list. Emma, 4 years old, burn on her face, talent sealed. Leo, 7 years old, 3rd-degree exhaustion, talent sealed. Ray, 12 years old, scar on his face, aggression, talent sealed. Nora, 9 years old, fever, talent sealed. Owen, 8 years old, a festering wound on his right shin, talent sealed. Sam, 6 years old, doesn't speak, talent sealed. Chloe, 10 years old, cough, talent sealed. Mark, 11 years old, an old injury to his left shoulder, talent sealed. Alice is 5 years old, Sam's twin, never leaves her brother's side, talent sealed. Finn is 10 years old, blind in his right eye, talent sealed. 10 sealed talents, 10 children whom the world has written off. In the kingdom of Valenheim, things are simple. Strength decides everything. Children whose talents awaken by the age of 7 go to the Royal Academy of Asterion. There, they are molded into knights, mages, and commanders. Those whose talents haven't awakened are called empty vessels. They're sent to church orphanages, sold into the mines, or simply left to die. The 10-year war with the northern clans has wiped out an entire generation of men. The treasury is empty. Villages have been burned to the ground. The country needs heroes. And here are 10 defective children, and 1 halfwit as their guardian. Magistrate Harold Venn chose Ethan on purpose. He'll sign anything for a bowl of soup. When the children start dying, all the blame will fall on him. Bets were already being placed at the town tavern. Most gave Ethan 2 weeks. The most generous bet was 3. Ethan sat against the wall and looked at the list. Then he closed the panel. Then he opened another one. Guardian points. Current balance, 15. Credit for the first act of care, accepting food from a child's hands and sharing it with them, plus 15. He opened the guardian's shop. The list was short. A recipe for bone broth made from butcher's scraps. Cost, 12 points. A recipe for a healing herbal compress. Cost, 8 points. A blueprint for a simple roof repair. Cost, 10 points. A method for working with childhood trauma. Cost, 20 points. He had 15 points. Enough for the broth. Not enough for the compress. Not enough for the roof. Not nearly enough for everything at once. Ethan closed the shop. He stood up. He looked at the children. Emma was sitting on the floor, finishing her half of the bread. Leo was lying on the cot, turned away toward the wall. Ray stood by the door with his arms crossed over his chest. The rest were huddled in a corner, quiet, like little mice, used to not taking up space, used to being invisible. Ethan sighed. For 12 years, he'd been pulling kids just like these out of the same kind of hell. Without resources, without a support system, without magic, just him and them. And he'd managed. Not always, not perfectly, but he managed. At least there was a roof here, even if it was full of holes. There was a system here that promised that something incredible lay dormant inside each of these children. And all it took to awaken it wasn't training or a stick. It was care, real care, daily. The mindless, routine work he'd done his whole life. Ethan smirked. They had no idea who they'd just appointed as guardian. He bought the broth recipe. His balance dropped to 3 points. A detailed set of instructions unfolded in his mind. Bone broth made from butcher shop scraps. Cooking time, 6 hours. Ingredients, bones, trimmings, onions, root vegetables, salt, water. Ethan memorized the list and headed for the door. Ray didn't budge. He asked where Ethan was going. Ethan said he was going to get food. Ray said there was no money. Ethan said he didn't need any money. Ray looked at him as if he were an idiot. Ethan stepped out into the gray morning of Cross Hill. Cross Hill was a town that had forgotten what hope was. The streets were dirty. The houses were crooked. Half the shops were boarded up. The war had ended 3 years ago, but here it continued every day. In the faces. In the empty stares of the women who had never seen their husbands return from the front. In the limping men who drank from morning on the porch of the only bar. Ethan walked down Main Street and caught people's eyes on him. Contemptuous, mocking. He knew from others' recollections that the former Ethan Reed had been the laughingstock of the whole town. He'd stumble on level ground. He'd drop everything he picked up. Once, he dropped a bucket of water on the town elder's foot. It was a small town. People don't forget things like that. The butcher shop stood on the corner of the market square. The sign hung crookedly. Bundles of dried herbs dangled above the entrance. Inside, it smelled of blood and salt. Behind the counter stood a burly man with red hands and a brown apron. Greg Lang, the town butcher. The man who chased away beggars with a stick and wasn't shy about talking about it. Ethan walked in. Greg looked him up and down. He asked what he wanted. Ethan said he'd come for the bones and scraps that Greg threw away every night anyway. Greg snorted. He asked why on earth he'd give anything to some country bumpkin. Ethan said he was proposing a deal. He'd pick up the scraps every day. In exchange, once a week, he'd bring a pot of broth like nothing Greg had ever tasted in his life. Greg looked at him. Then he burst out laughing so hard that a jar of spices fell off the shelf. He said, "Let's do it." He tossed a bag of bones onto the floor. "Choke on it," he said. Ethan picked up the bag. It was heavy, about 10 kilograms. His former owner's scrawny body could barely manage it. He thanked him and headed back. On the way, he plucked some wild onions from the roadside. He found a couple of roots by the fence of an abandoned house. There was no salt at the shelter. He returned and searched every corner. In the crack between the wall and the floor, he found an old rag with a handful of gray salt. Enough. There was only one pot at the shelter, an old one. It had a crack in it. Ethan patched the crack with clay from the bank of the stream behind the shelter. He built a fire with the last of the firewood. He put the bones in. He poured in water. He added the onions and roots. And he waited. 6 hours. The children watched. At first from a distance, then closer. The smell of the broth filled the shelter after 2 hours. Thick, meaty, lively. Emma was the first to approach. She stood next to the pot and stared intently at the boiling water. Alice followed, leading the silent Sam by the hand. Then Nora, then Chloe. Even Ray came out of his corner and sat down by the wall, pretending he didn't care. Ethan stirred the broth and counted the children. All 10 were in the room, for the first time in a long time. 6 hours later, the broth was ready. Thick, rich, with a film of fat on the surface. Ethan ladled it into bowls. There were 7 bowls. 3 of them had to eat from mugs. He handed it out to everyone. He didn't eat any himself. He said he was full. That was a lie, but there wasn't enough food for 11 servings. The children ate, silently, greedily. Emma burned her mouth and blew on her spoon. Chloe coughed between mouthfuls but didn't stop. Owen ate with one hand because he was holding his injured leg with the other. Leo sat in the corner with his back to everyone. His shoulders were shaking. He was crying into his plate, quietly, so no one would see. Ethan saw. He didn't go over, didn't hug him, didn't say anything. He knew the boy didn't need words right now. He needed a hot meal and the right to cry without witnesses. The system beeped. The first hot meal in 43 days, plus 15 guardian points. Leo's affection from 0 to 8. Emma's affection from 0 to 6. Nora's affection from 0 to 4. Chloe's affection from 0 to 5. Alice's affection from 0 to 4. Sam's affection from 0 to 3. Ethan looked at the numbers. 18 points in his balance. 3 left over from last time, plus 15 new ones. Ray's was still at 0. Mark's was at 0. Finn's was at 0. Owen's was at 1. 4 out of 10 hadn't budged, or had barely budged. Ethan wasn't surprised. He knew from his past life that the older children shut themselves off the most. They need more time, more proof, more days when an adult doesn't leave. That evening he put everyone to bed. There were still 4 blankets.
He gave them all to the children. He tucked Emma and Alice in together. Sam lay down next to his sister and, for the first time that evening, unclenched his fists. Nora and Chloe were together. Leo was on his own because the boy couldn't stand being touched. Owen was on his own because he needed to keep his legs straight. Ray, Mark, and Finn said they didn't need blankets. Ethan didn't argue. He took off his jacket, teared it into 3 pieces, placed 1 on each of their beds. He walked over to the wall, sat down. He leaned his back against the wall. The system beeped again. Put them to sleep without tears. Plus 10 guardian points. Sam's affection went from 3 to 6. Owen's affection went from 1 to 4. Finn's affection went from 0 to 2. Mark's attachment, 0 to 1. Ray's attachment, 0. Ray still wasn't moving. He lay on the cot with his arms crossed over his chest, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't asleep. He was keeping watch. Ethan recognized this behavior. In his past life, he'd seen boys like this dozens of times. The ones who were the oldest in the group. The ones who felt responsible for the younger ones. The ones who couldn't relax until they were sure everything was quiet. Ray didn't trust him, and he was right not to. Trust isn't earned in a single evening. Ethan sat by the wall and didn't sleep. The night was cold. Through a hole in the roof, he could see the stars. Unfamiliar, alien, not a single constellation from his past life. He closed his eyes, and the system unfolded the growth chronicle before him. He saw a preview of each child's future based on their current trajectory. Emma, 4 years old, talent sealed. 5-year prognosis, death from exhaustion. 10-year prognosis, not applicable. Leo, 7 years old, talent sealed. 5-year prognosis, sold into the mines. 10-year prognosis, death in the mine shaft. Ray, 12 years old, talent sealed. 5-year prognosis, street thug. 10-year prognosis, executed for robbery. And so on. 10 lines, 10 prognoses. They all ended the same way. Death, slavery, oblivion. That was the trajectory under current conditions, without intervention, without care, without family. Ethan looked at these lines and felt something inside him clench into a fist. Not anger, not pity, something sharper. Something that made him want to get up and act. Not think, not plan, just act. He closed the chronicle, opened the shop, bought a recipe for a medicinal herbal compress for 8 points. His balance dropped to 20. The compress required herbs, 3 kinds: plantain, chamomile, calendula. All 3 grew behind the shelter by the stream. He knew this from other people's memories. The former Ethan Reed was useless at everything except one thing. He knew the surroundings like the back of his hand. Every path, every bush, every rock. Ethan stood up. He slipped out quietly. He gathered the herbs by moonlight. He returned. He crushed them. He mixed them according to the recipe. He applied the compress to Owen's festering wound. The boy shuddered in his sleep but didn't wake up. Ethan sat nearby and changed the compress every hour. By morning, the redness around the wound had subsided. The pus had stopped oozing. The system beeped. It had healed the old wound. Plus 20 guardian points. Owen's affection had jumped from 4 to 12. A spike. A big one. Ethan understood why. Owen had been walking around with that wound for weeks, maybe months. No one had treated it. No one cared. But then someone got up in the middle of the night, gathered some herbs, sat by his side until morning, changed the bandage, not because he had to, but because he saw that it hurt. In the morning, Owen woke up and looked at his leg, then at Ethan. He didn't say anything, he just looked. Then he turned away and pulled the blanket up to his chin, but Ethan noticed. For the first time all morning, the boy wasn't pressing his hand against his leg. There was a knock at the shelter's door. Ethan opened it. Standing on the threshold was Greg Lang, the butcher. He was holding an empty pot. Yesterday, as was his custom, had left some of the broth in the pot and taken it to the butcher that evening as a down payment. Greg stood there, looking at Ethan with a strange expression. His wife was standing behind him. She was crying. Greg said he didn't know what had happened yesterday. He said his wife had been crying all night and claimed she hadn't eaten anything so delicious since she was a little girl. He said his wife was telling him to take all the children to their house. Ethan said there was no need to take them.
He said that if Greg gave him bones and scraps every day, there would be broth every week. Greg was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. Then he reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a piece of meat wrapped in a rag. Real meat, not scraps. He said it was from his wife. Ethan took it. He thanked him, closed the door, looked at the piece of meat in his hands, then at the 10 children who had already woken up and were staring at the meat as if they were witnessing a miracle. Today, they'd have real stew. For the first time in God knows how long. The system beeped quietly in the background, but Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He was cutting the meat on cutting board and counted out portions. 11. One for himself, too. There would be enough for everyone. Ethan had arranged with the butcher, Greg Lang, to trade bones for broth and fed the children their first hot meal in 43 days. That night, he treated Owen's festering wound with a herbal compress bought at the guardian's shop. In the morning, Greg brought a real piece of meat from his wife. The 6 children's affection began to grow, but Ray's remained at 0. On the 3rd day, Ethan set to work on the roof. The hole was the size of a wagon wheel. Every time it rained, half the hall flooded. The children slept on wet cots and coughed at night. At the guardian's shop, there was a blueprint for a simple roof repair costing 10 points. Ethan had 32 points. He bought the blueprint. A detailed set of instructions unfolded in his mind. He needed boards, straw, clay, ropes. There were no boards at the shelter, but there was an abandoned sawmill outside the city. The former Ethan Reed remembered the way. It was an hour's walk there, 3 hours back with the boards. Ethan set out at dawn. He returned around noon with 4 boards on his shoulders. The body of his former self was weak and thin. His shoulders were on fire. His back was aching. He dumped the boards against the wall and sat down to catch his breath. Ray stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't help. He didn't get in the way. He just watched. Ethan didn't ask for help. He stood up and climbed onto the roof using an old ladder. The ladder wobbled. A rung cracked under his foot. He kept his balance, climbed up, got to work. An hour later, Ray appeared on the roof next to him. He didn't say a word.
He just picked up a board and handed it to him. Ethan took it. He didn't say thank you. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just nodded and continued working. They worked in silence for 3 hours. By evening, the hole was patched up. Crooked, rough, but patched up. The rain wouldn't get inside tonight. The system beeped. Collaborative work with a child, plus 15 guardian points. Ray's affection rose from 0 to 5. 5, not much, but it was the first step. The first crack in the wall the boy had been building around himself for 12 years. Mark helped too, from below, handing up tools. His left shoulder was injured, and he couldn't raise his arm above his head, but he found a way to be useful. Mark's affection went from 1 to 4. Finn sat by the wall and listened. He was blind in his right eye and couldn't climb onto the roof, but he heard every hammer blow, every creak of a board, every steady breath from Ethan, who worked without complaint. Finn's attachment from 2 to 4. That evening, Ethan cooked a stew with the meat Greg had brought. He added wild onions and roots. The children ate, and Ethan watched them and counted. Nora was still coughing. Her fever wouldn't break. She needed a healer, not a herbal compress, but a real healer. There was a temple in Cross Hill, small, old, with a single healer. Ethan knew from others' memories that this healer was Claire Windsor, 24 years old, quiet, polite, with dark circles under her eyes, the only one who agreed to treat orphans for free. She came once every 2 weeks, treated what she could, then left. The temple didn't pay her for it. On the contrary, they scolded her for wasting healing magic on the useless. On the morning of the 4th day, Ethan went to the temple. It was a gray stone building with peeling paint on the walls. Inside, it smelled of wax and mold. A priest sat behind the counter. He was fat and sleepy. He looked at Ethan as if he were a cockroach. Ethan asked where Claire was. The priest said that Healer Windsor was on duty and only saw those who paid. Ethan said he needed to speak with her. The priest said 5 copper coins for the visit. Ethan didn't have a single copper coin. He stood at the counter and thought. Then he turned and left. Outside, at the temple entrance, a girl was sitting, thin, pale. The circles under her eyes were so dark they looked like bruises. She was eating a piece of bread crust and looked as if she hadn't slept for 3 days. Ethan stopped. He asked if she was Claire Windsor. She looked up. She nodded. She asked what had happened. Ethan said he had 10 children at the orphanage. 3 had fevers. 1 had a festering wound that he'd treated with a compress, but it required proper medical care. Claire stood up. She brushed off her skirt. She said she'd come by that evening. Ethan said it would be better right now. Nora had been burning for 3 days. Claire looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She followed him. At the orphanage, Claire examined all 10 of them. Silently, thoroughly. Her hands glowed with a faint greenish light when she touched the children. Healing magic. Weak, barely noticeable. But Ethan saw how the children relaxed with every touch. Nora stopped shivering. Her fever began to subside. Chloe stopped coughing for 20 minutes. Owen's wound turned pink. Living tissue. Not dead. Claire worked for 2 hours without a break. Then she sat down on the floor and closed her eyes. She said her gift was too weak. She said they considered her useless at the temple. She said she couldn't completely heal any of them, only provide relief, only slow it down, only buy time. Ethan sat down beside her. He said that over the past year, she had come to this shelter 26 times, for free, without thanks, without recognition. Claire turned to him, surprise in her eyes. She asked how he knew. Ethan said the children had been keeping count, every single visit. Every time someone felt better, they remembered. Little Emma had drawn 26 little lines on the wall with a stick, 1 for every time the kind aunt came. Claire looked at the wall. She saw the lines, 26 even lines scratched by a child's hand into the gray stone. She covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. She cried quietly, just like Leo had last night, silently, without a sound. That's how people cry when they're used to no one caring about their tears. Ethan didn't try to comfort her. He simply said that she had saved Nora today, that the fever was subsiding, that she needed to sleep, that he would take the watch himself. Claire looked up. Her eyes were wet and red. She said she had nowhere to go. The temple had closed the dormitory. Her room had been given to a new novice. She had been sleeping on a bench in the reception hall. Ethan stood up. He walked over to an empty cot. He placed one of the 4 rags that served as blankets on top of it. "Here," he said. "Sleep." Claire lay down. 30 seconds later, she was asleep. Deeply, motionless, like someone who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. The system beeped. Claire's affection, 0 to 22. The recipe for the 21st century healing potion has been unlocked. Ethan looked at the sleeping Claire, then at the 26 little marks on the wall, then at Emma, who was sitting next to Claire and stroking her hair. A tiny hand, a sunburned cheek. 4 years old. This little girl had been counting the healer's visits and drawing them on the wall, because it was important to her. Because in a world where everyone abandons others, she remembered those who came back. Ethan sat down by the wall and closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd have to find more food, fix the second cot with find fabric for blankets, bathe the children, do the laundry, find a way to earn at least a few coins.
57 days until the inspection.
He had 37 guardian points, 10 children, 1 healer on the floor, and not a single ally in town besides the butcher and his empty pot. Ethan smiled in the darkness. It had been worse. Ethan repaired the orphanage's roof together with Ray, and for the first time, Ray's affection shifted from 0 to 5. Claire Windsor came to heal the children and stayed at the orphanage after the temple had evicted her. Her affection immediately jumped to 22, 57 days until the inspection. On the 5th day, Ethan realized he needed to bathe the children, not because the system required it, because this wasn't right. 3 of them hadn't bathed in at least a month. Their hair was matted. Their skin was gray with dirt. Their clothes were stiff as boards. In his past life, Ethan remembered taking new children to the shower room at the orphanage. Some screamed. Some fought. Some didn't know what hot water was. There was no hot water here. There was a stream behind the orphanage, cold, clean, and there was a kettle in which he could heat water. Ethan got up at dawn. He hauled water from the stream 10 buckets. His former owner's body creaked after working on the roof, but his hands still obeyed him. He heated the water in the kettle. He found a bar of lye that had once been used to scrub the floors. He announced bath time. The reaction was predictable. Emma didn't understand what was happening. Alice pressed herself against Sam. Sam was silent, as always. Nora coughed from nervousness. Chloe hid behind the cot. Owen said his leg hurt and he couldn't do it. Leo turned away toward the wall. Mark and Finn exchanged glances. Ray crossed his arms and said he wouldn't do it. Ethan didn't argue. He poured warm water into the largest bowl. He sat down next to it. He rolled up his sleeves. He picked up a rag, and he began to wash his hands. His own. Demonstratively. He lathered them up, rubbed them, rinsed them, then his face, then his neck. The water turned gray. He showed the kids. "See," he said, "that's dirt. It was on me. Now it's gone. Now, who's next?" Emma stepped forward. She held out her hands. Ethan washed them gently. Warm water, soft movements, no rush. He washed her hands and told her that in his past life there was a thing called a bathtub, a whole room just for washing. With hot water coming out of the wall, with bubbles, with rubber ducks. Emma asked what a rubber duck was. Ethan said it was a little yellow duck that floats in the water and quacks when you squeeze. Emma laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed in his presence. The sound was such that Ethan forgot to breathe for a second. Clear, high-pitched, lively, like a bell. She laughed, and Alice came over too. Sam followed her, then Nora. One after another, Ethan washed each of them, changed the water, heated up fresh water. An hour and a half of work. When it was Ray's turn, he was standing at the back of the line. His arms were still crossed, but he was standing in line. He hadn't left. Ethan handed him a rag, said if he wanted to, he could do it himself. Ray took the rag, silently washed his hands and face, tossed the rag into the basin, left. Ray's attachment, from 5 to 7. Slowly, but surely, after washing up, the question of clothes arose. The children's old clothes were in such a state that there was no point in washing them. They were rags upon rags. Ethan had been thinking about it all day. That evening, Claire suggested they visit Lady Iris Valefor. She said that Lady Valefor surely had some old fabric or unwanted clothes at her estate. Ethan asked who Lady Valefor was. Claire explained. She was the youngest daughter of a fading aristocratic family, 28 years old. She'd come to Cross Hill to manage the family's last estate. Formally, she was listed as the sponsor of this orphanage. Her mother had made a donation before her death. The daughter had conveniently forgotten about it. Ethan asked what she was like. Claire thought for a moment. She said she was smart, sarcastic, cold. She talks as if she's playing a role in a play. She thinks everyone around her is a fool. And, for the most part, she's usually right. Ethan nodded. He said he'd go see her tomorrow.
On the morning of the 6th day, he was walking along the road toward the Valefor estate, a large house on a hill. Not a palace, but not a shack either. Stone walls, an iron gate, a garden that was once beautiful but is now overgrown. In the courtyard, a servant was grooming a horse. Ethan approached the gate. He knocked. The servant looked at him and grimaced. He said the lady wasn't receiving visitors.
Ethan said he was the guardian of the orphanage that was supported by the Valefor house. The servant snorted. He left. He returned 10 minutes later. He said, "Come in." Lady Iris Valefor was sitting in an armchair in the parlor with a book. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her back was straight. Her dress was simple but made of fine fabric. Her face bore an expression of mild boredom, which was clearly her usual state. She looked at Ethan. She looked him up and down. She said that finally, at least someone had remembered that the orphanage existed. She asked what he wanted. Money. Ethan said no. He said that her estate surely had an attic full of books and a basement full of old furniture. He said he was asking for access to the books for the children, and fabric, if there was any she didn't need. In return, he offered the older boys labor, to fix whatever needed fixing, to tidy up the garden, to repair the furniture. Iris raised an eyebrow. She said it was the strangest proposal she'd ever received in her life. She said that usually people wanted money, patronage, or her hand in marriage. But this man was asking for books and rags in exchange for children's labor. Ethan said it wasn't child labor. It was learning a trade. The children would learn to fix things and, in the process, see that beyond the orphanage there was a world where their work had value. Iris was silent for about 10 seconds. Then she laughed. Not politely, not sarcastically, genuinely. The sound was unexpected, as if she herself was surprised that she could laugh like that. She said, "All right. The books are in the library on the 2nd floor. Fabric and old clothes are in the storeroom. Let them come." Ethan thanked her. He stood up. He walked toward the door. Iris called out to him. She asked his name. Ethan told her his name. Iris repeated his name. She said she'd remember it. The system beeped. Iris's affinity went from 0 to 15. Access to the Valefor House Resource Network was granted. Ethan didn't know what a resource network was, but it sounded useful. He returned to the shelter with 3 bags of old clothes and a stack of books. The clothes were fancy, made of good fabric. Some of it needed mending. Claire picked up a needle. It turned out she knew how to sew. Not just that, she sewed beautifully. In one evening, she remade 4 children's shirts from a single men's doublet. Ethan watched as the children put clean clothes on their clean bodies. Emma twirled in front of Claire in her altered dress and smiled. Chloe kept stroking the sleeve of her new shirt. She couldn't stop. Sam and Alice received matching shirts and, for the first time in a long while, looked like twins rather than street urchins. Leo put his on silently, but he didn't take it off. Not even at night. He slept in it. The system was flooding them with notifications. Everyone's attachment was growing, slowly, but for everyone. Except Ray. Ray took the shirt, nodded, put it on. Attachment level 7 to 8. 1 point. Ethan didn't rush them. At night, Claire read a book to the children, one of the ones Ethan had brought from the Valefor estate. A fairy tale about a knight who saved a dragon. Not a princess from a dragon, but a dragon from hunters. Emma listened with her mouth agape. Alice fell asleep first, snuggling up to Sam. Nora stopped coughing and fell asleep too. Leo lay with his back turned but wasn't asleep. He was listening. Ray sat against the wall and pretended he didn't care. Claire read in a soft voice, and Ethan stood in the doorway watching them. 10 children, clean, in decent clothes, well-fed, under a roof that doesn't leak, and a woman reading them a bedtime story. 6 days ago, there was a hole in the ceiling here and 10 hungry eyes in the dark. He did it. Not with magic, not with a system, with bone broth, with herbal compresses, with nails and boards, with old clothes from someone else's attic. The very same things he'd been doing for 12 years in his past life.
only now he had an interface that counted points and told him he was on the right track. 54 days until the inspection. 10 talents are still sealed. Not a single one has awakened. He needs at least one for the inspection. Ethan closed his eyes and opened the Chronicle of Growth. The forecasts had changed. Emma, 4 years old. 5-year forecast based on current trajectory. Alive. Healthy. Talent on the verge of awakening. Leo, 7 years old. 5-year forecast. Alive. Exhaustion overcome. Hidden potential, marked with the commander's sign. Ray, 12 years old. 5-year prognosis. Alive. Early leader. Group protector. Potential. Undetermined. 10 lines.
And for the first time, not a single one ended with the word death. Ethan closed the Chronicle. He sat on the floor next to the door. He leaned against the wall, and for the first time in 6 days, he fell asleep before midnight. Ethan organized a bath for the children and managed to get even Ray to participate willingly. Claire advised him to contact Lady Iris Valefor, who provided books and clothing in exchange for the older boys' help with household chores. The Growth Chronicle's prognoses changed for the first time, and not a single child's prognosis no longer ended in death. Iris's affection immediately rose to 15. On the 7th day, Sophie Lang arrived. The butcher's daughter, 22 years old, broad shoulders, hands strong from working at the market, red hair tied back with a rag, a voice so loud it could be heard 3 streets away. She walked into the orphanage without knocking. She was carrying a basket of meat. She set it on the table. She looked around. She looked at Ethan. She looked at the children. She looked at Claire, who was mending a blanket in the corner. She said her father had sent her.
She said he'd been walking around like a zombie for 3 days now, and had been cooking that broth according to the recipe Ethan had shown him. She said her mother cried every evening at dinner because the broth reminded her of her childhood. She said the whole thing was suspicious, and she'd come in person to see what kind of circus was going on here. Ethan thanked her for the meat. He invited her to stay for dinner. Sophie snorted. She said she wasn't going to have dinner with a bunch of snotty orphans. Then she looked at Emma, who was standing next to the basket, running her finger over a piece of meat, as if it were something magical. Sophie fell silent. She crouched down. She looked Emma in the eyes. Emma looked at her calmly. She reached out and touched Sophie's red hair. She said it was beautiful. Sophie swallowed. She stood up. She said, "All right." 1 dinner. She didn't stay for just 1 dinner. She stayed until nightfall. She cooked alongside Ethan, meat with onions and herbs. She chopped faster. He seasoned more precisely. They worked at the same pot and never once bumped elbows, as if they'd done it 100 times. Sophie noticed. She glanced at him. She didn't.
At dinner, she sat between Chloe and Nora. Chloe coughed, and Sophie, without a word, moved her farther away from the drafty window. Nora spilled broth on her shirt, and Sophie wiped her mouth with her sleeve. Her movements were automatic. She didn't even realize what she was doing. Ethan noticed. After dinner, Sophie washed the dishes and talked with Ray. Or rather, she was talking. Ray was silent. She was telling him how she'd dropped a pig at the market that morning and chased it 3 blocks. Ray listened. At one point, one corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, the shadow of a smile. A ghost. But Ethan saw it. When Sophie was about to leave, Mark came over and asked if she'd be coming tomorrow. Sophie opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Ethan. Ethan shrugged. Sophie said, "Maybe." She left. She came back the next day with a bigger basket. On her 3rd visit, she didn't even knock anymore. She'd just walk in and start cooking. On the 4th evening, she stayed after dinner and taught Ray and Mark how to hold a knife properly. Not a combat knife, but a kitchen knife. How to cut meat, and how to carve around a bone. She demonstrated, and they repeated after her. For the first time in days, Ray was focused on something other than survival. He was doing it, and he was getting the hang of it. Sophie patted him on the shoulder and said it wasn't bad for a start. Ray didn't answer, but he didn't pull his shoulder away. Ray's affection ran from 8 to 11. Sophie's affection ran from 0 to 12. Ethan watched. Sophie was one of those people who didn't know how to be tender with words. She was tender through her actions, her hands, food, a pat on the shoulder, her presence. She didn't tell the children that she loved them. She came every day and fed them, and that was more than any words could say. On the 9th day, Ethan realized that Sophie was talking to him differently. Not like he was some village fool, not like he was some eccentric who'd taken in 10 orphans, but as an equal. She asked how he knew so many recipes. Ethan said that in a past life he had cooked a lot. Sophie didn't understand the phrase, but didn't ask for clarification. She decided he meant before he became a guardian. Ethan didn't correct her. They were standing on the porch of the orphanage. It was evening. The children were asleep inside. Claire was on duty with Nora, who still coughed at night. Sophie leaned on the railing. She said that her father had wanted a son his whole life. He'd told her that when she was 6, just like that, without any resentment, like a fact. She said that ever since then, she'd been proving to him that she was just as good as a boy. She hauled carcasses, she chopped meat, she fought thieves at the market. She never cried in front of him, she never wore a dress, she never asked for a doll. Ethan was silent. Sophie looked at him. She said he was strange. She said that all the men in town either avoided her or tried to make light of things. But he was just listening. Ethan said she didn't have to be as good as a boy. It was enough for her to be Sophie. Sophie fell silent. She turned away. Her ears turned red. She said it was nonsense. She said she was going home. She walked away at a brisk pace. Ethan watched her go. The system beeped. Sophie's affinity, 12 to 20. Hidden talent detected. Berserker defender. Status, dormant. Inherited through the maternal line. Source unknown. Ethan blinked. Berserker defender. Sophie Lang, the butcher's daughter. A red-headed girl with a loud voice and red ears. Berserker. He closed the panel. He shook his head. Nothing in this world was a coincidence. On the 10th day, what Ethan had both been waiting for and fearing at the same time happened. That evening after dinner, Emma was sitting by the hearth. The fire was dying down. They were running out of firewood. Ethan was about to go gather some kindling. Emma stared at the dying embers. She reached out her hand, and the fire flared up. Not from the wood, not from a spark, from her palm. A small tongue of flame, orange with a white tip. It burned for 3 seconds and went out. Emma looked at her hand, then at Ethan. Her eyes were huge. She wasn't scared. She was surprised. Ethan knelt down beside her. His voice was steady, calm, just like back then, in his past life, when a 6-year-old boy showed him his drawing for the first time and waited for his opinion. Ethan said it was beautiful. He told the boy he'd done a great job. He told her not to be afraid. It was hers. Emma smiled. She held out her hand again. The fire flared up. This time, for 5 seconds. Brighter, stronger. The pot with the leftovers from dinner began to bubble again from the heat. The system exploded with notifications. Emma's affinity, 26. Threshold surpassed. Talent awakened. Rank changes from dormant to awakened. Element, fire. Magic type, innate. Potential. The scale flickered. The numbers changed. Potential undetermined. Additional growth in affinity required for a complete diagnosis. Ethan stared at these lines, and his hands trembled. Not out of fear, not out of joy, out of understanding. This 4-year-old girl with a burn on her cheek, whom the world had called an empty vessel, had just ignited a fire with her bare hands, and she didn't need the academy to do it. She didn't need the continent's best mentors. She didn't need years of training. All she needed was some hot broth, clean clothes, a bedtime story,
and an adult who hadn't walked away. Claire stood in the doorway, watching the fire in Emma's palms. Her face was pale. She whispered that it was impossible. Ethan said it was possible. He said it was only the beginning. Ray stood in the corner. His eyes were wide open.
For the first time in all those days, there was an expression on his face that Ethan couldn't read. Not surprise, not fear, something in between. Something like hope that's afraid to be hope. Leo sat on the cot and looked at Emma, silently. Then he shifted his gaze to his own hands. He clenched and unclenched his fists. The system showed Leo's attachment level from 8 to 14. A spike. Not because of Ethan's concern, because Leo had seen that it was real, that an empty vessel could awaken talent, that hope isn't a lie. Ethan stood up. He looked at the 10 of them. 9 pairs of eyes were looking at Emma. The 10th pair, Emma's own, was looking at her palm. She had lit a fire again. A small one. A warm one. And she laughed. The same laugh she'd had back when Ethan was telling the story about the rubber duck. Pure, high-pitched, like a bell. The children around her were watching that fire. And Ethan suddenly realized that this wasn't just the awakening of a talent. It was the moment when the other 9 children saw for the first time that they too could do it. That something was sleeping inside them too. That being an empty vessel wasn't a death sentence.
That the world that had written them off was wrong. The system chimed softly in the background. The home aura, condition verified. All 10 children under one roof. Each has at least 3 bonds. The home aura is activated. Current radius, 30 meters. Within the aura, the children heal faster. They learn faster. Protection against external threats, active. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. Night, stars, foreign constellations, cold air. Behind him lay a warm shelter with 10 children and 1 healer. 1 talent awakened. 50 days until the inspection. He needed at least 1 more, just to be safe. But right now, at this very moment, he allowed himself to simply stand there and breathe. At the bar 3 blocks away, bets were still being taken on his failure. But today, one of the regulars told Greg the butcher that maybe the kid would pull through after all. Greg replied that he couldn't, he would pull through, and he bet 3 silver coins on it. Ethan didn't, but the system knew. A small icon was flashing in the corner of the panel. Reputation in Cross Hill. Status, from contempt to curiosity. Progress, 10%. Sophie Lang began coming to the orphanage regularly to help with cooking and teaching the older boys. She turned out to have a hidden talent as a berserker, a defender's talent, inherited from her mother. On the 10th day, little Emma awakened her fire talent, becoming the first awakened child out of 10. The house's aura activated within a 30-meter radius. 50 days until the inspection. On the 11th day, Sheriff Bart Calder arrived at the orphanage. Without warning, early in the morning, the children were still asleep. Ethan stood by the pot, stirring the morning porridge made from the grains Sophie had brought yesterday. Bart walked in without knocking. Behind him were 2 guards, one with a piece of paper, the other with a stick. Bart looked around, his face twisted. He had expected to see filth and starvation and dying children. Instead, he saw a repaired roof, a clean floor, a pot of porridge simmering on the stove, 10 children on cots under blankets, and Claire, the healer, who was sleeping on the 11th cot by the wall. Bart showed no surprise. He was a bureaucrat. Bureaucrats know how to hide their feelings. He said he had come for a follow-up inspection. He said he had the right to inspect the premises and question the children. He said that if he found any violations, the inspection period might be shortened. Ethan put down his spoon. He wiped his hands. He asked what specific violations the inspector was looking for. Bart smirked. He said, for example, unsanitary conditions, or malnutrition, or abuse. He said that witnesses had seen Ethan dragging the children to the stream and forcing them to wash in cold water. Ethan said the water was warm, heated in a boiler. The children bathed of their own free will. Bart turned to the officer with the pad. He told him to write it down. The guardian acknowledges that the children bathed outdoors. Ethan looked at him, silently, calm. He'd seen people like this in his past life. Child welfare inspectors who came not to check but to find fault. Not to help but to shut things down. They always had a form and always had a reason. And the only way to deal with them was to give them absolutely no grounds for complaint. Not a single one. Ray woke up. He sat up on the cot. He looked at the guards. His body tensed instantly. Ethan saw the boy clench his fists under the blanket.
Ethan shook his head, barely noticeably. Ray saw it. He relaxed his hands, but he didn't lie back down. Bart was pacing the room, touching the walls. He kicked the leg of the cot. He peered into the cauldron. He grunted. He walked over to Emma, who had woken up and was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest. He leaned down. "Are they treating you well here, little girl?" he asked. Emma looked up at him. Then she looked at Ethan, then back at Bart. She shook her head. Bart said, "Are they feeding you?" Emma nodded. Bart asked, "What did you eat yesterday?" Emma said, "Stew." Bart asked, "And the day before yesterday?" Emma said, "Broth with onions." Bart straightened up. His face was sour. He'd been expecting different answers. He turned to Ethan. He said the inspection wasn't over. He said he'd be back in a week. He said that if a written report on the expenditure of guardianship funds wasn't provided by then, the orphanage might be closed early. Ethan asked what guardianship funds. He hadn't been given a single coin. Bart smiled, widely. His teeth were yellow.
He said that according to the records, Magistrate Venn had transferred 20 silver coins to the orphanage's account at the beginning of the month. Ethan hadn't received any 20 silver coins. He understood. The money had been stolen, embezzled by Bart or Magistrate Venn, or both. And now they were demanding a report on money they hadn't. A trap, simple and dirty. Bart left. The guards followed him. The door slammed shut. Silence. Claire woke up from the noise and sat on the cot, pale. She'd heard everything. She said this was bad. She said Bart was working for Magistrate Venn. She said Venn wanted to shut down the shelter and take over the building. She said she'd heard about it at the temple a month ago. Ethan nodded. He sat down on a stool. He thought. He needed an ally with clout, with a name, with papers that would outweigh the magistrates. He remembered Iris Balfour. She was a sponsor of the orphanage. Her mother had put the donation in her name. That meant the House of Balfour had legal rights to this orphanage, rights that outweighed the authority of the city bailiff. Ethan stood up. He told Claire he was leaving for a couple of hours. He asked Ray to keep an eye on the younger ones. Ray nodded, without a word, without asking questions. Ethan took note of this. For the first time, the boy had accepted an assignment from him without talking back. The system showed Ray's attachment level at 12. When it reached 12, yesterday it had been 11. He hadn't done anything special that night. He'd just slept against the wall, as usual. He understood. Ray had seen that Ethan gave away his blanket every night and slept against the wall with nothing but the bare essentials. He'd seen it and kept track of the nights. Ethan went to the Balfour estate. Iris received him in the same living room, in the same armchair, with the same book. As if she hadn't moved in 3 days. Ethan told her about Bart, about the fake report, about the 20 silver coins that were missing. Iris listened without interrupting. When he finished, she closed the book. She set it on the table. She said that Harold Venn was a scoundrel, but not a fool. She said he'd pulled this stunt 3 times already with other institutions in the county, a church school, a poorhouse, and a veterans shelter. All 3 were closed. All 3 buildings now belonged to Baron Trevor, who paid Venn to clear the land. Ethan asked if the House Balfour step in. Iris looked at him. For a long time. Then she said he could. She said she had a document her mother had signed before she died. A deed of gift for the land under the shelter. This land belongs to the House of Balfour, not the city. The magistrate has no right to seize it. But there's a condition.
The document is valid only as long as the orphanage is still operating. If the orphanage closes for any reason, the land passes to the city. Ethan understood. They didn't just need to survive until the inspection. They needed to pass the inspection flawlessly, so that neither Bart nor Ven would find a single reason to shut it down. Iris said she would personally oversee the paperwork. She said she would send her attorney to the inspection. She said that Ven might be able to falsify the reports, but he couldn't forge the Valfor house seal. Ethan thanked her. Iris stopped him with a gesture. She said there was no need to thank her. She said her mother had bequeathed this orphanage to her for a reason. She said her mother herself had grown up an orphan.
Ethan didn't know that. Iris didn't explain any further. Iris's bond, from 15 to 21. Ethan returned to the orphanage. He told Claire. Claire let out a sigh. Then she said there was another problem. Nora. The fever had returned, worse than before. Claire had been treating her every day, but her gift was running low. She needed rest, but she couldn't rest while the child was burning up. Ethan opened the shop. A 21st century recipe for a healing decoction. It was unlocked when Claire's bond reached 22. Cost, 0 points. Free. A gift from the system. Ethan read the recipe. A fever-reducing decoction made from willow bark and honey. Simple. Effective. Willow bark could be found by the stream behind the shelter. There was no honey. Ethan went outside and headed to the butcher's. Greg was standing behind the counter. Ethan asked if he knew anyone who kept bees. Greg thought for a moment. He said old Willem lived on the outskirts. He said Willem didn't sell honey for money, only in exchange for meat. The circle was complete. Ethan proposed a deal to Greg. Meat for Willem in exchange for honey for the shelter. Greg would deduct the cost from future portions of broth. Greg shook his head. He said, "Hey kid, someday you'll just ask like a normal person." He reached under the counter. He pulled out a jar of honey. He said his wife had bought it yesterday. "Take it." Ethan took it. He asked how much he owed. Greg waved his hand. He said, "It's nothing." He said his wife would kill him if she found out he'd taken money from a man with 10 kids and not a single coin to his name. The system didn't show any affection for Greg. Greg wasn't part of the team. He was just a person. Just a guy with a butcher shop who started doing something he hadn't done before, because someone nearby showed him it was possible. Ethan made a decoction. Claire gave it to Nora. By morning, the fever had subsided. Completely. For the first time in 2 weeks, Nora woke up without a fever or a cough. She sat up on the cot and looked around as if she were seeing the shelter for the first time. Then she smiled, quietly, just with her lips. Nora's attachment level from 4 to 15. A jump. A huge one. The system explained it. A critical healing. The child realized that her life had been in danger and that an adult had done everything to save her. The attachment multiplier had doubled. Claire sat next to Nora and held her hand. Her eyes were closed. She was smiling. For the first time in all these days, not out of politeness, out of relief. Ethan stood in the doorway and counted. Day 12. 1 talent awakened. 9 sealed. Attachment is growing in everyone. 48 days until the inspection. Bart will be back in a week. Iris is preparing the paperwork. The butcher provides food for free. Claire is treating them. Sophie helps with cooking and teaches the older kids. He's not alone. For the first time in both his lives, he's not alone. The system beeped softly, as if to confirm. Guardian points balance. 53. Ethan closed the panel. He looked at the sleeping children. Then at the roof, which no longer leaked. Then at the pot where breakfast was bubbling. Then at Claire, who had fallen asleep sitting up, holding Nora's hand. He took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Claire's attachment rating, 22 to 26. Bailiff Bart conducted a surprise inspection and tried to frame Ethan with a fake report about non-existent guardianship funds. Iris Valfor revealed that the land under the orphanage belonged to her family and promised legal protection. Ethan brewed a fever-reducing decoction from the guardian's shop and completely cured Nora of her fever. 48 days until the inspection. On the 14th day, Ethan caught the thief. Night. The children were asleep. Claire was on watch by Leo's cot. He was moaning in his sleep from nightmares. Ethan was sitting by the wall,
looking through the growth chronicle, when he heard a creak, a quiet one, coming from the window. He closed the shutter. He stood up. He approached silently. A slender hand was hanging through the window opening. Fingers were groping along the windowsill. A pot stood on the edge. That very one. The only one. With a crack patched with clay. The hand grabbed the pot's handle. Ethan grabbed the hand. A tug. A short scream. A body tumbled off the windowsill. Small. Skinny. Dirty. A girl. She looked about 15, but was most likely older. Just small from hunger. Tattered clothes. Short hair, unevenly cut with a knife. Her eyes were wild. Angry. Frightened. She wrenched herself free from his grip and recoiled against the wall.
She curled up into a ball. She held out her hand in front of her, clutching a small knife. The blade trembled. Ethan didn't move. He stood 3 steps away. His hands were in plain sight. His voice was steady. He asked her name. She didn't answer. Her teeth were clenched. Ethan said he wasn't going to hit her. She snorted. She said, "Everyone says that." Ethan said he wasn't everyone. She said, "Everyone says that too." Ethan smirked. He took a step back, sat down on the floor. Now he was lower than her, no longer a threat. That's what he'd been taught in his past life. With an aggressive child, don't stand over them. Sit down. Make yourself small. Show that you're not dangerous. He asked if she was hungry. She remained silent. He stood up, slowly. He walked over to the pot. He poured the leftover porridge into a bowl. He set it on the floor between them. He sat back down. She looked at the bowl, at him, at the bowl, at the knife in her hand. Then she put the knife away. She grabbed the bowl with both hands. She ate greedily. She choked. She didn't chew. She swallowed. Ethan waited. When the bowl was empty, she set it on the floor. She wiped her mouth with her sleeve. She looked at him. "Rosa," she said. Ethan nodded. "Ethan," he said. She said she knew who he was. The whole town knew. The fool who took in 10 orphans. Ethan said yes. That's the one. She paused. Then she said she didn't need help. That she was on her own. That she was always on her own. Ethan said he understood. He gave her a blanket. He pointed to a free corner by the wall. He said if she wanted to, she could spend the night. In the morning she'd leave, and no one would ask where she was going. Rosa took the blanket. She lay down in the corner. She didn't sleep. Ethan knew she wasn't sleeping. He could hear her breathing, steady, controlled. The breathing of someone used to not sleeping in unfamiliar places, used to waiting for an attack. He didn't sit next to her. He didn't keep watch. He went back to his wall, lay down, closed his eyes, showed that he trusted her, that he wasn't afraid to sleep next to her, that the knife under her jacket didn't bother. In the morning, Rosa was gone. The blanket was folded. The bowl was washed and put back in its place. Ethan smiled. A person who's about to disappear forever doesn't wash their dishes. The system showed Rosa's affection level from 0 to 5. A sealed talent detected. Shadow Scout. The class is considered extinct. The last recorded bearer was 120 years ago. Ethan read it twice. Shadow Scout. Extinct class. 120 years. He closed the panel and went to make breakfast. Rosa returned 2 days later. Not through the window, through the door. She was carrying a bag. Inside the bag were 3 loaves of bread. She said she'd snatched it from the baker. Ethan looked at the bread. He looked at Rosa. He said he couldn't accept stolen bread. Rosa flared up. Her face flushed with anger. She said she'd tried her best, that she'd taken a risk, that if she'd been caught, they would have cut off her hand. Ethan said that was exactly why he couldn't take it, because next time, they might cut off her hand, and he needed both her hands intact. Rosa opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she asked why he needed her hands. Ethan said that she knew how to move silently, to see in the dark, to notice things others didn't, that she didn't need to steal, that those skills were worth more than 3 loaves of bread. Rosa was silent for a long time. Then she asked what he was offering. Ethan offered her a job. Rosa would keep watch over the area around the shelter. Keep an eye on who comes and goes, who's lurking in the alleys, who's watching. In exchange, food, a roof over her head, a place at the table. Rosa said she'd think about it. She left. She came back in the evening, without any bread, but with information. She said that 3 men had been standing in the alley behind the shelter for the 3rd night in a row. Not locals, dressed like mercenaries, 1 with a sword, 2 with knives. They watched the shelter from sunset until midnight and then leave. Ethan went cold. He asked, since when? Rosa said since the day Emma showed the fire. Ethan realized. Rumors of the awakening had spread throughout the city. Someone was already watching. Someone was already counting. The system beeped. A house aura alert. Hostile intentions detected within a 50-meter radius. Ethan closed the panel. He looked at Rosa. He looked at the sleeping children. Then he looked out the window at the dark alley. He knew that sooner or later this would happen. That the awakening of their talents would attract attention. That the world, which had written these children off, would not be pleased when it realized it had been wrong. He needed someone who knew how to handle a weapon. There was only one such person in Cross Hill. Everyone talked about her. Everyone pitied her. No one was suitable. Hannah Pierce, a former junior officer, a veteran of the 10-year war, 23 years old with a 1,000-yard stare. Every evening she drank at the bar until closing time. Every morning she woke up on a bench against the wall. Every day the same routine. Ethan decided he would go see her tomorrow. But tomorrow didn't come in the way he'd expected. During the night, a sound woke him. A quiet scraping, coming from the back wall. Someone was trying to open the shutter. The system was flashing red. The home aura alarm. Hostile intrusion. Distance, 10 meters. Ethan stood up. Rosa was already standing by the window. Silent, motionless, like a shadow. She held up 2 fingers. Then she pointed at the back wall. 2 of them. Ethan nodded. He didn't know how to fight. The previous owner's body was weak. In his past life, he hadn't been a fighter. He'd been a teacher. But teachers know how to defend themselves too. He grabbed the poker from the hearth. Heavy, made of iron. He walked over to the back wall. The shutter creaked. It opened. A head appeared in the opening. Ethan struck the shutter with the poker. The shutter slammed shut. The head barely had time to duck out of the way. A curse rang out from outside. Then silence. Then footsteps. Receding. Quick. They were gone. Ethan stood with the poker in his hand, listening to his heart pounding. Ray stood behind him, with a knife from the kitchen. When he'd managed to get to his feet, when he'd managed to grab the knife, Ethan didn't know. Ray looked at the shutter, then at Ethan. He said that next time, he'd be on watch. Ray's devotion from 12 to 16. A leap. Ethan understood why. Ray saw that Ethan had stood between the danger and the children. He didn't run away, didn't hide. He stood there with the poker and struck. For a 12-year-old boy who was used to adults running away at the first sign of trouble, this was proof. Not words, action. In the morning, Ethan went to the bar. The bar was called the Torn Horseshoe, the only drinking establishment in Cross Hill. No low ceiling, dark beams, the smell of beer and sauerkraut. At 10 in the morning, it was empty inside, except for one person. Hannah Pierce was sitting in the far corner with her back to the wall facing the door. A soldier's stance. Even when drunk, she never sat with her back to the entrance. A mug stood in front of her, half empty or half full, depending on who was looking. Ethan sat down across from her. Hannah looked up. Gray eyes. Dull. A gaze that had seen too much. A 1,000-yard stare. Ethan knew that look. In a past life, he'd worked with veterans at a shelter. Former soldiers who'd returned from war and couldn't get back to normal life. Who drank to forget. Who woke up in a sweat from sounds that no one but them could hear. Hannah looked at him. She asked what he wanted. Ethan said he had 10 children. That his shelter was being watched. That 2 people had tried to break in that night. That he needed someone to teach his children not to be afraid. Not to kill. Not to fight. Not to be afraid. Hannah took a sip from her mug. She set it down. She said he'd come to the wrong place. She said she wasn't a teacher. She said she was a soldier whose entire squad had been killed under her command. She said she had nothing to teach. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't say she was wrong. He didn't try to comfort her. He said he understood. He said that in his past life, he too had lost people. Not in war, in an orphanage. Children he couldn't protect from the system, who were taken into families where they were beaten, whom he couldn't bring back because the law was on the side of those who beat them. Hannah looked at him, for the first time, with interest.
Not with drunken indifference, with genuine attention. Ethan said he wasn't asking her to save the world. He was asking her to come and show 10 children that it's normal to be afraid, that there's no shame in being afraid, that you can be afraid and still stand your ground. He said that there was no one else left. Hannah was silent for a long time. The mug stood untouched in front of her. She stared at the table. Then she looked up. She asked how old they were. Ethan said between 4 and 12. Hannah closed her eyes. Then she opened them. Something had changed in them. No light appeared, but the darkness became less dense.
She said she'd come by to take a look, just to look. She wasn't promising anything. Ethan said that was enough. He stood up. He walked toward the door. Behind him he heard a sound, a quiet one, the sound of a mug tapping against the table, half empty. For the first time in 3 years, Hannah had set down her glass without finishing it. That evening, Hannah came to the shelter. She stood at the gate for 10 minutes before going in. Ethan watched from the window. He didn't rush her. He didn't go out. He waited. She came in. The children looked at her warily. A new adult, a new threat, or maybe not. Hannah stood by the door and looked at them. 10 thin faces, 10 pairs of eyes. Emma approached first. As always, this girl was the first to approach everyone, without fear, without calculation, simply because that's how she was. She looked up at Hannah. She touched the belt around her waist. Was she a soldier? She asked. Hannah said she had been. Emma asked, and who is it now? Hannah didn't answer, because she didn't know. Ethan came over. He invited her to sit down at the table. Dinner was ready. Broth, meat from Greg, herbs from the roadside, bread that Sophie had brought that morning. Hannah sat down. She ate in silence. Slowly, neatly. Even when drunk, she ate like a soldier. Every bite chewed thoroughly, not a crumb wasted, a habit from field rations. After dinner, she stayed. She sat by the wall. She watched Claire read to the children, watched Ray check the shutters on the windows before bed, watched Ethan tuck the younger ones in. How Emma fell asleep clutching the hem of his sleeve in her fist and not letting go. Hannah watched all of this, her face set like stone, but her hands rested on her knees and her fingers were relaxed, not clenched into fists, relaxed. She left after midnight, didn't say goodbye. She came back the next day, and the next. On the 3rd day, she came in the morning, sober. Ethan didn't say a word about it, didn't praise her, didn't comment out loud. He just gave her a bowl of porridge and nodded toward an empty chair. Hannah sat down. She ate. She watched the children. Then she stood up and went out into the yard. She called Ray over. "Show me how you stand," she said. Ray didn't understand. Hannah said, "Show me how you stand when you're afraid." Ray frowned. He said he wasn't afraid. Hannah said that everyone is afraid. It's not about fear, she said. It's about where you put your body when fear comes. She demonstrated a stance, a simple one. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight on the balls of the feet, arms relaxed, chin down, back straight, not a fighting stance, the stance of someone who's ready for anything. Ray copied her. It was off, clumsy. Hannah corrected him, without words, with her hands. She moved his foot, straightened his back, she lowered his shoulders. Ray stood there with a strange expression on his face. Concentration, not anger, not fear, pure concentration, as if, for the first time in his life, he were doing what he was made to do. Mark approached. He stood beside him. He tried to replicate the stance with one working arm. Hannah looked at his injured shoulder. She said nothing. She stepped closer. She demonstrated a modified stance, for a fighter with only one working arm. Different balance, different weight distribution. Mark copied her. He did it better than Ray. Hannah nodded. Hannah's affinity, 10 to 15. The system beeped. Connection to the house confirmed. Ethan stood on the porch and watched as the former sergeant taught 2 boys how to stand. Not how to fight, how to stand. And that was more important than any combat technique, because a child who knows how to stand won't run away when things get scary. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat by the window. He was thinking. Rosa had said that the mercenaries hadn't returned after that night with the poker, but that didn't mean they were gone. It meant they'd become more cautious, or were waiting for reinforcements, or had received a new order. He needed to find out who had sent them, Bart, or someone bigger. He opened the Chronicle of Growth. The forecasts had been updated. For the first time, a line appeared next to Ray's name that hadn't been there before. Potential class, Guardian. Ethan didn't know what it meant, but it sounded right. A boy who had been protecting 9 others since he was 12, who was the first to get up at the slightest noise, who slept with a knife under his pillow, not because he feared for himself, but because he feared for them. Guardian. Ray's affinity was 18. It was growing, slowly, steadily, just like Ray himself. 41 days until the inspection. Ethan found Hannah Pierce at the bar and convinced her to come to the shelter. Hannah began teaching Ray and Mark the basic stance. On the 3rd day of her visits, she arrived sober, and the system confirmed her enrollment in the house. In Ray's Growth Chronicle, the potential Guardian class appeared for the first time. 41 days until the inspection. On the 20th day, Ethan took the children outside the shelter. For the first time, all 10 of them, to the Cross Hill Market Square. It was a calculated move, not a walk. A strategy. The town knew about the orphanage only through rumors. The rumors varied. Some said Ethan was starving the children. Others said the children were already dead, and he was hiding the bodies. Still others claimed he'd sold them into the mines, and was living off guardianship funds that didn't exist. Ethan knew from his past life that the best way to dispel a rumor was to reveal the truth. He led the 10 of them to the square at 10 in the morning. The market was open. People were trading. 20 steps from the butcher's shop to the vegetable stand. 50 from the stand to the blacksmith's shop. The whole town in a single square. The children walked in pairs. Ray led the way, Mark brought up the rear. Between them were 8 younger children. Clean, dressed in remade clothes from the Valefor estate. Thin but not emaciated. Pale but not ashen. Alive. The town fell silent. Ethan walked beside Emma, who was holding his hand and turning her head in all directions. She was seeing the market square for the first time in her life. To her, it was like another planet. Apples, carrots, fish on the counter, a horse at the hitching post, a blacksmith with a hammer, a dog sleeping in the shade. She pointed at everything in sight and asked what it was. Ethan answered every question. The town watched, in silence. A woman from the apple stand approached. She held out an apple to Emma. Emma looked at Ethan. Ethan nodded. Emma took it. She said thank you. The woman smiled. Then she started crying. She turned away. Ethan didn't ask why. He knew. This woman had suffered her own losses, her own war, her own children, who might no longer be with her. Greg stood by the bench and watched the procession. His face was red. He turned away when Ethan looked at him. Then he called out to his wife to bring out some meat pies for the children. His wife brought them out, a whole trayful. The children ate the pies in the square, and the town watched them, and something was changing. Not right away, not for everyone, but it was changing. An old blacksmith approached Ethan. He said he had some extra nails and door hinges. If Ethan needed them, he should come by. A fabric merchant said she had some scraps. Good ones, enough for blankets. The tavern owner, who had been taking bets on Ethan's failure, stood in the doorway and said nothing. Then he went inside. Ethan later heard from Greg that the bets on his failure had closed that day. Not because everyone believed him, but because people were too ashamed to bet anymore. Sophie showed up an hour later. She stormed into the square, cursing because no one had told her. She scooped Chloe up into her arms. Chloe wrapped her arms around Sophie's neck and didn't let go for the rest of the walk. Chloe's affection from age 5 to 13. Sophie didn't notice. She was busy picking out a hair ribbon for Chloe from a vendor. She bought the ribbon with her own money, a blue one. Chloe fiddled with the ribbon in her hair and smiled so much that Ethan turned away because his eyes started to sting again. By noon, they were back at the shelter. The kids were excited. So many experiences in a single day. Emma was telling Claire about the horse, about the dog, about the apple, about the pies. Claire listened and smiled. Nora showed Owen a pebble she'd found in the square. Smooth, round, blue. She said it was beautiful and that she would keep it forever. Sam and Alice were sitting in the corner, and Alice was whispering in her brother's ear. Sam was listening. His face was impassive as always, but his hands rested relaxed on his knees. He wasn't clenching his fists. Leo was sitting on a bench, drawing with a stick on the dirty floor. He was drawing the market square. Stalls, people, the blacksmith shop. Exactly. In detail. Every line in its place. Ethan looked at the drawing, then at Leo. The boy was drawing from memory. He'd been in the square for an hour and a half, and had memorized the location of every stall, every person, every entrance and exit. This wasn't a child's drawing. It was a map, a tactical one. The system beeped softly.
Leo's affinity from age 14 to 17. Growth chronicle updated. Potential class confirmed. Commander, tactician, strategist. Ethan sat down next to him. He asked what he was drawing. Leo said he was drawing the square. Ethan asked why. Leo was silent for a moment. Then he said he wanted to remember it, in case he had to run away, so he'd know where to go. Ethan felt something inside him tighten. The 7-year-old boy wasn't drawing a picture. He was drawing an evacuation plan, because his whole life had been a flight from one place to another. Ethan said they wouldn't have to run. Leo didn't answer. He didn't believe him. Just like Ray on the first day, Ethan didn't press the issue. He knew that words meant nothing. Only days mattered, one after another. No running away, no betrayal, no vanishing into the night. That evening, Iris sent a servant with a note. The note had 3 lines. Bart had filed a complaint with the magistrate regarding the unauthorized removal of the children to the city. The magistrate had scheduled an additional inspection in 5 days. Iris asked them not to worry and was preparing the documents. Ethan read the note, crumpled it up,
threw it into the hearth. He looked at Claire, who was sitting next to him, and saw the look on his face. She asked what had happened. Ethan said that Bart wasn't giving up. Claire said she knew. She said that Bart had come to the temple yesterday. He'd asked about her, why she had left, where she lived, who had allowed her to treat children without a license from the temple. Ethan looked at her. He asked if she didn't have a license. Claire shook her head. She said the temple had revoked her license when she left. Technically, she had no right to treat anyone. Technically, every time she touched a child with healing magic, she was breaking the law. Ethan closed his eyes. He opened them. Another trap. Bart was attacking on every front. Children in the square without permission, an unlicensed healer, a guardian without funds. 3 violations that individually meant nothing, but together provided grounds for early closure. Ethan thought he needed to gain the upper hand from under Bart's feet, not to defend, to attack, not to wait for an inspection, to stage his own, on his own terms, publicly, so the whole city could see. He turned to Claire.
He asked if she could prepare a medical report on each child in 3 days, their health status upon admission and now, and the difference. Claire nodded. Ethan turned to Ray, who was standing in the doorway. He asked if Ray could, within 3 days, teach the younger kids to demonstrate what they could do. Not talents, everyday skills, washing their hands, making their beds, helping one another. Ray nodded. Ethan turned to Rose, who was sitting in the shade by the window. He asked if she could find out exactly when the inspector would arrive and how many people he would bring with him. Rose nodded. She disappeared into the darkness. Rose's shift was from 5 to 9. Ethan sat down at the table. A plan was taking shape in his mind. In 5 days, an inspector from the magistrate's office would be standing at the shelter's doorstep, and Ethan was going to put on a show for him that would make a vein pop out of Bart Calder's forehead. Ethan led all 10 children out to the market square, and the town saw them alive and well for the first time. The townspeople began volunteering to help. Leo drew a tactical map of the square from memory, and the system confirmed his skill as a commander. Bart filed a complaint, and the magistrate scheduled an additional inspection in 5 days. Ethan is preparing a public demonstration. The 5 days flew by in a flash. Ethan worked 18 hours a day. Claire compiled medical reports, 10 documents, 1 for each child. Condition upon admission, exhaustion, fever, festering wounds, cough, injuries. Condition after 25 days, all alive,
All had gained weight, and the wounds had healed. The fever had been defeated. Chloe's cough had almost gone away. Mark's shoulder hadn't fully healed, but the pain had subsided. Claire wrote each document in neat handwriting on paper that Iris had sent from the estate. Ray trained the younger ones. Every morning they got up, making the beds, washing hands, falling in. Not military style, just like at home. Just lining up and showing that you can stand up straight. Ray was strict but fair. He didn't yell. He spoke quietly, and the children obeyed because he was Ray, the eldest. The one who stayed awake when everyone else slept.
The one who stood at the door with a knife when strangers tried to break in. Sophie came every day and cooked. The shelter's kitchen had become her domain. She ruled there like a general. Ethan didn't argue. She was the better cook. Hannah trained Ray and Mark in the mornings. Stance, breathing, movement. Not strikes, movement. How to dodge, how to fall without getting hurt, how to get up quickly. The basics that distinguish a soldier from a civilian. Rosa would disappear at dawn and return at night. Every evening she brought back information. Bailiff Bart met with Magistrate Venn twice a week. The inspector wouldn't be coming from the city. He'd be coming from the provincial capital. A man named Grant Moss, a mid-level official. Not incorruptible, but not entirely incorruptible either. It depends on the amount. Iris sent a note saying she knew Grant Moss, that he was ambitious, that his career is important to him, that if they show him something he can pass off as his own achievement, he'll side with the orphanage. Not out of kindness, out of self-interest. Ethan read the note and smirked. Iris had been playing this game her whole life. She saw people as chess pieces. Not because she was cruel, because she'd grown up in a world where everyone played that way. Day 25, morning. Grant Moss arrived on horseback, with 2 clerks, in the blue uniform of the provincial office, a round face, a neat mustache, the look of a man seeking not the truth, but material for a report. Bart met him at the city gates. He walked alongside him and talked non-stop. Ethan watched them from the window. Rosa stood nearby and commented. She said Bart was carrying a folder of documents, a thick one. She said one of the clerks was yawning, the other was taking notes. She said that Moss was nodding but not listening, a good sign. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. He stood up straight, hands behind his back. His face was calm. Inside, everything was tightening up, but on the outside, not a single sign of it. 12 years of working at the orphanage had taught him one thing. Never let an inspector see that you're nervous. Only the guilty get nervous. Moss approached. He introduced himself. His voice was even, formal.
He said he had arrived in response to a complaint from the city bailiff for an unscheduled inspection of the living conditions of the children at Orphanage No. 4 in the city of Cross Hill. Ethan invited him inside. Moss entered, followed by Bart. Bart was smiling, anticipating triumph. The orphanage was clean. The floor was swept. The bunks were made. The pot was on the stove. The smell of food. 10 children stood in a line, clean, dressed, backs straight. Ray stood first. His face was stony, a scar across his eyebrow, eyes fixed straight ahead. Behind him were Mark, Finn, Chloe, Nora, Owen, Leo, and Alice, Sam, and little Emma at the end, with her burn on her cheek and eyes that looked at the world as if it were full of wonders. Moss surveyed the line. He looked around the room. He checked the food supplies. He checked the water. He checked the cots. Every seam on the blankets. Every nail in the wall. Bart followed behind him, pointing things out. There's a crack here. There's a draft here. A board's creaking here. Moss took notes, silently. Then he turned to Ethan. He asked where the medical records were. Ethan nodded toward Claire. Claire approached. She handed him 10 reports. Moss took them. He began to read. He read for a long time, carefully.
His expression didn't change, but Ethan noticed him raise his eyebrows twice, once on Nora's report, which stated that a third-degree fever had been cured without hospitalization, and once on Owen's report, which stated that a festering wound had been healed with a herbal compress in 3 days. Moss looked up. He asked who had treated them. Claire said it was her. Bart immediately intervened. He said she didn't have a temple license, that she was practicing illegally, that every act of treatment was a violation. Moss looked at Bart, then at Claire. He asked Claire when her license had been revoked. Claire said 3 weeks ago, after she left the temple and moved into the orphanage. Moss asked why she left. Claire paused. Then she said that the temple had forbidden her from treating children from the orphanage, that it called it a waste of resources on the useless. Moss took notes. His face was unreadable. Ethan was waiting for his moment. Here it was. Ethan said he wanted to show them something. Moss nodded. Ethan turned to Emma. He crouched down, looked her in the eyes, nodded.
Emma held out her hand, opened her palm. Fire. A small flame, orange with a white tip. It burned steadily and calmly. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Moss dropped his pen. The scribe behind him stopped writing. Bart opened his mouth. His face turned pale, then red, then green. Ethan said it was Emma. 4 years. Official status, an empty vessel. Her talent had awakened 15 days ago. No academy, no mentors, no training. Moss closed his mouth, opened it, asked how. Ethan said he'd fed her, given her clean clothes, fixed the roof, read her a bedtime story. Moss looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he looked at Emma, then at the fire in her palm, then back at Ethan. He said this needed to be documented, officially, that he was required to report it to the provincial office, that the awakening of a talent in a child with official empty vessel status was an event that had to be registered and reported. Bart intervened. His voice trembled. He said it might be a fake, that an expert evaluation was needed, that the boy might have somehow faked it. Moss turned to him. He asked coldly how exactly one could fake fire magic coming from the hand of a 4-year-old child. Bart fell silent.
Moss turned to Ethan. He said the orphanage was passing inspection. All the children were alive. All were in satisfactory condition. 1 talent had been documented. The paperwork was in order. The medical reports were being accepted. He would forward the issue of the healer's license for review, but the orphanage would remain open. Bart stood as white as a sheet. His hands were shaking. He turned and walked out without saying a word. Moss gathered his papers. He approached Ethan, quietly so the clerks wouldn't hear. He said that in 12 years of service, he'd never seen anything like it. He said he'd report it personally to the provincial capital. He said that if Ethan could revive even 1 more person by the time of the fall inspection, it would be an event that would be noticed at the very top. Ethan nodded. Moss left. Silence. Claire sat on the cot, trembling. Then she laughed, quietly, nervously. Then she cried. Then she laughed again. Ray stood by the door, his face impassive, but his hands finally relaxed. Ray's attachment from 18 to 22. Sophie burst in 10 minutes later. She'd heard it from her father. The whole market had heard it. She stormed in and yelled that they were all idiots and why hadn't anyone told her. Then she hugged Emma, then Chloe, then Nora, then everyone in turn. Then she looked at Ethan. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything. She just punched him in the shoulder, hard. Sophie's attachment from age 20 to 25. Hannah was standing by the fence outside. She didn't go inside. She didn't want to get in the way. Ethan went out to her. She said 1 sentence. She said he needed security, constant security, because after today, people who don't place bets in bars would come after these kids. Ethan knew she was right. The system was flashing in the corner of his vision. Reputation in Cross Hill. Status, from curiosity to respect. Progress. 35%. In the square, among the crowd that had gathered to watch the inspector, stood a woman in a raincoat, a stranger. She was jotting something down in a small notebook. Then she left, quickly. Rosa noticed her. She told Ethan. She said the woman had arrived 2 days ago. She was staying at the town's only hotel. She pays in silver, a lot of silver. She asks about the orphanage, about the children, about the gift of fire. Ethan asked what she looked like. Rosa described her. Tall. Dark hair, expensive clothes under her raincoat, a ring with a coat of arms on her right hand.
Rosa couldn't make out the coat of arms. Ethan closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the orphanage, at the smoking chimney, at the 10 children who, for the first time in a long words, were laughing and running around the yard, at Claire, who was sitting on the porch and smiling at the sun, at Sophie, who was chasing Chloe with a ribbon in her hand, at Hannah, who was standing by the fence and, for the first time in 3 years, wasn't thinking about the glass. It was all so fragile. It could all be destroyed with a single blow. And someone was already watching. The system beeped in the background. A wide area alert. External surveillance activity detected. Source: the Ashcroft House. Recommendation: prepare defenses. On the 30th day, Ethan met Min-ji Han. He wasn't looking for her. She found him on her own. It was an ordinary morning. Porridge in the pot, the children at the table. Claire was changing the bandage on Mark's shoulder. Sophie was cutting meat for lunch. Hannah was chasing Ray around the posts in the yard.
Rosa was sitting on the roof, looking down at the road. It was Rosa who saw her first. She came down and told Ethan that a stranger was heading toward the shelter, alone, unarmed, carrying a travel bag, and wearing Eastern-style clothing. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. The woman was walking slowly along the path. Her back was straight, her stride was steady. Her black hair was tied in a bun at the nape of her neck. Her face was calm, motionless, like a mask. She approached the porch, stopped, looked at Ethan, bowed, briefly, precisely. She said her name was Min-ji Han, that she was a traveling teacher, that she was stuck in Cross Hill because of debts and was looking for work. Ethan looked at her, then at Rose, who was standing in the shadows by the wall, nodding her head almost imperceptibly. Rose didn't trust her. Neither did Ethan. It was all too convenient. It was too timely. He invited Min-ji inside. He offered her tea. There was no tea. He offered her water. Min-ji accepted it. She drank slowly, in small sips. Every movement was precise. Not a single unnecessary gesture. Ethan asked where she was from. Min-ji said she was from the east, from the country of Sohan. Ethan asked what she taught. Min-ji said calligraphy, writing, reading, the basics of Eastern literature. Ethan asked why she'd left Sohan. Min-ji was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said she'd had disagreements with her former employer. Ethan didn't press her. He could tell by looking at her hands, slender fingers with calluses from the brush, but beneath the calluses were old scars, thin, straight, from rope. She'd been tied up a long time ago, professionally. She wasn't just a teacher. Ethan offered her a job, reading and writing lessons for 10 children, payment in the form of food and a roof over her head. Min-ji agreed instantly, too quickly. It confirmed that she had nowhere else to go. She started that very day. She sat down at the table. She took the brushes and ink out of her travel bag. She called the children over. Emma came up first. As always, Min-ji showed her how to hold the brush. Emma took it. She drew a line, crooked, uneven. Min-ji adjusted her fingers, gently, precisely. Emma drew a second line, straighter, a third, even straighter. Min-ji froze. Her mask cracked. For a split second, something flashed in her eyes. Surprise or recognition. She hid the expression so quickly that Ethan barely noticed. But he did notice. He remembered. By evening, Min-ji had taught all 10 of them. She showed each one the basics. She corrected each one. She was patient with each one, equally, evenly, without favoring anyone. Professionally. Too professionally for a traveling teacher in debt. That's how they teach in royal palaces. Ethan knew this because in his past life, he'd seen the difference between a volunteer and a teacher with 30 years of experience. Min-ji was in the latter category. That night, when everyone was asleep, Ethan opened the system. Min-ji's affinity rating? From 0 to 8. Quickly.
The system didn't show hidden talents in adults, only in children, but it showed something else. Min Ji Han's status, the last practitioner of the Moon Mirror School's sign magic style. The style is considered lost. Potential compatibility with students being checked. Ethan closed the panel. Sign magic. The Moon Mirror School. A lost style. And this woman had come to him on her own, to a city at the edge of the world, with debts and rope scars on her wrists. There are no coincidences.
On the 32nd day, the woman with the ring returned. Rosa spotted her near the hotel. She was meeting someone, a man in a gray raincoat. His face was hidden by a hood. They spoke for 10 minutes. Then the man walked north along the road out of town. The woman returned to the hotel. Rosa followed the man to the edge of the forest. A carriage was waiting for him there. The carriage bore a coat of arms. Rosa sketched the coat of arms on the ground with a stick and showed it to Ethan. Ethan showed it to Iris. Iris turned pale. She said it was the coat of arms of the House of Ashcroft. She said that the Ashcroft house was an old aristocratic clan that bought up talented children all over the country. She said they didn't haggle, they just took them. Ethan asked what took them meant. Iris looked at him for a long time. Then she said that they come with documents, with seals, with decrees from the magistrates they've bought off, and they take the children as property, legally, officially, with no possibility of contesting it, unless someone of equal or greater influence stands behind the children. Ethan asked if House Valefor carried equal. Iris was silent for a moment. She said that he used to be. Now the House of Valefor is just her. One woman, with a family name and a half-empty estate, up against a clan with 40 estates and a seat on the royal council. But she said she'd try. She said she'd write to her uncle in the capital. He's at court. He knows people. He can pull the right strings, if he wants to. Iris's bond lasted from 21 to 28. 20 days until the fall inspection. 7 days. Ethan sat on the porch at night and counted. 1 talent had been awakened. That would be enough for the inspection. But Moss said that if any more were awakened, those at the top would notice. And those at the top included the Asterian Academy, and House Ashcroft, and the Order of the Ashen Seal, about which Ethan knew nothing yet. Every awakened talent is both a shield and a target. The system beeped. The growth chronicle was updated. Leo's affinity had reached 22. Nora's affinity was 20. Owen's affinity is 19. 3 are approaching the threshold of awakening. Ethan closed his eyes. 25. The threshold. At 25, the lock opens. A dormant talent becomes awakened. 3 children within arm's reach. He just had to keep going. Feed them, heal them, teach them, put them to bed, read books, fix furniture, be there for them, day after day. No heroics, no feats of valor. Just be the adult who never leaves. Min Ji Han came to the orphanage as a teacher, and the system identified her as the last bearer of the lost style of sign magic. A scout from House Ashcroft met with a member of the clan, and Iris confirmed that Ashcroft takes talented children by force. The 3 children's attachment is nearing the threshold of awakening at 25. There are 28 days until the autumn inspection. On the 40th day, Leo awoke. It happened at night. Ethan was on watch by the window. Hannah was sleeping by the door. Rosa was on the roof. Claire was sitting next to Nora, reading by candlelight. Leo was moaning in his sleep. As usual, nightmares plagued him every night. Ethan knew the boy was seeing the same thing. A fire. The village. Parents he doesn't remember but who died in the war. He walked over to the cot, sat down beside it, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. He didn't shake him. He didn't wake him. He just held him. A heavy, warm hand. An anchor. Leo stopped moaning. His breathing evened out. Then he opened his eyes. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Ethan's hand on his shoulder. He didn't move it away. For the first time, he didn't move it away. He said quietly that he'd dreamed of the village again. Ethan said he knew. Leo said there was always a fire in the village, and he couldn't do anything about it. He just stood there and watched. Ethan said the fire was in the past, but he was here now. Here. Under a roof that isn't burning, next to people who aren't going anywhere. Leo was silent.
Then he said he was afraid. Ethan asked what of. Leo said he was afraid that it would all end, that the shelter would close, that they'd be separated, that Ethan would leave like everyone before him. Ethan didn't say he wouldn't leave. He'd already said that. Words faded away. Instead of words, he took off his jacket. That very one. The only one. The one he tore to pieces every night and gave to the children. The one he sewed back together every morning with crooked stitches. It had more seams than fabric. He laid the jacket on Leo. "Here," he said. "As long as you have this, I won't go anywhere." Leo clutched the jacket with both hands.
He pressed it to his chest. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep, without nightmares, for the first time in 40 days. The system beeped. Leo's affinity rose from 22 to 27. Threshold cleared. Talent awakened. Rank changes from dormant to awakened. Class, commander. Type, tactical vision. Description, the ability to see the entire battlefield, the disposition of forces, weak points, and escape routes. Potential, highest. Ethan looked at the sleeping boy. 7 years old. Commander. The very same boy who had drawn a map of the market square with a stick on the floor, who had counted the entrances and exits, who planned evacuation routes because his whole life had been a flight. Now his talent gave him what he'd always sought, the ability to see everything, to control, to protect, not to run, to stand and see. In the morning, Ethan didn't tell Leo about his awakening. He didn't want to pressure him. The boy would find out on his own, when he was ready. Instead, Ethan turned his attention to something else. 20 days until the inspection. 2 talents had been awakened, Emma and Leo. That was enough. But Ethan wanted more. Not for the inspection, for safety. Every awakened child wasn't just an achievement for the report. It was power, a shield, a bargaining chip. The Ashcroft family wouldn't go after an orphanage with 3 awakened children. Or they might, but they'd think twice. On the 43rd day, Nora awoke. Quietly. No drama. She was sitting by the stream, washing dishes. She dipped her hands into the water, and the water responded. It rose up. It wrapped itself around her wrists, as if it were alive. Nora wasn't scared. She laughed. She called for Claire. Claire ran over. She saw it. Her eyes grew huge. The system beeped. Nora's affinity, 26. Talent awakened. Rank, awakened. Element, water. Magic type, innate. Class, elemental healer. 3 out of 10. 43rd day. Ethan stood on the porch and watched Nora playing with the water by the stream. He watched Emma, who was sitting nearby, trying to light a small flame in the palm of her hand. Fire and water, side by side, not at odds, laughing. 2 girls who a month ago were dying of hunger and fever. Now one is lighting a fire while the other is summoning water. Claire stood next to Ethan, silently. Then she said she didn't understand how it worked, how broth and bedtime stories could awaken talents that the academy couldn't awaken over the course of years. Ethan said it wasn't about the broth. It was because the academy trained them, and he loved them. Claire looked at him for a long time. Then she turned away. Her ears turned red, just like Sophie's had that evening on the porch. Ethan didn't notice, or he pretended not to notice. Hannah noticed. She smirked. She didn't say anything. On the 45th day, Rosa brought news. The woman with the ring had left town, but before leaving, she left a letter for the innkeeper. Rosa stole the letter. She brought it to Ethan. The letter was addressed to the Ashcroft house. It mentioned 3 awakened talents at the Cross Hill orphanage. It stated that the talents had been awakened without the academy's involvement. It stated that the guardian was using an unknown method.
Recommendation: send a delegation to seize them. Timeline: after the fall inspection. Not before. After. They waited. They waited for the inspection to officially confirm the talents. Because only officially registered talents can be taken into custody. A trap within a trap.
The better Ethan performed in the inspection, the easier it would be for Ashcroft to take his children away. Ethan sat with the letter in his hand and thought. Then he called Iris, then Hannah, then Mindy. 4 adults at the table. Rose stood in the shadows by the wall. Claire stood by the door. Sophie stood by the stove because she thought better when she was cooking. Ethan placed the letter on the table. He said that Ashcroft House would come for the children after the inspection. He said they had 20 days to prepare. Iris said she would write to her uncle today. Hannah said she needed a weapon. Minji was silent. Then she said one sentence. She said she knew someone at Ashcroft House. Everyone looked at her. Minji said that this person owed her her life. She said that if she wrote to him, he would delay the delegation for a week, maybe 2. That would be enough time to get a reply from Iris's uncle in the capital. Ethan looked at Minji. He asked who she really was. Minji was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she had been Prince Sohan's tutor, that the prince had died, that she had been blamed, that her family had been executed, that she had fled and had been in hiding for 3 years, that her real name wasn't Minji Han. Silence. Claire pressed her hand to her lips. Sophie stopped cutting the meat. Hannah didn't move. Only her eyes narrowed slightly, the gaze of a soldier assessing a threat. Ethan said he didn't care who she used to be. What mattered to him was who she was now. Now she was a teacher who sat down at a desk every day and taught his children to read and write. Now she was the person who, in 2 weeks, had taught Emma to draw straight lines. Right now, she's part of this house. Minji looked at him. Her mask cracked. For real. Her lips twitched. She quickly looked away. Minji's attachment from age 8 to 22. A leap. Leo awakened his talent as a commander after Ethan gave him his jacket as a promise to stay. Nora awakened the talent of water. 3 out of 10 talents have been awakened. A letter from Scout Ashcroft was intercepted. The House of Ashcroft plans to remove the children after the inspection. Minji revealed her past as Prince Sohan's mentor. 10 days until the autumn inspection. Ethan gathered everyone, not just the children, everyone. Claire, Sophie, Hannah, Minji. Rosa. Iris had come from the estate. Greg came with his wife. Even the old blacksmith stood by the fence and listened. Ethan stood before them. He said that in 10 days an inspection team from the capital would arrive. Not a provincial official, one from the capital. According to Moss's report, he said that after the inspection, the House of Ashcroft would come for the children. He said he had a plan, not to hide, not to run, to show the capital something it couldn't turn away from. Not just 1 awakened, not 2, not 3, as many as possible, publicly, in the square, in front of witnesses, so that taking these children away would become politically impossible. Iris nodded. She said it was the right move. She said Uncle had replied to the letter. He's at court. He's interested. He's ready to support us if he sees results, not promises, results. Hannah said she'd ensure security, that by the time of the inspection, the perimeter around the square would be under control. Sophie said she'd feed the entire square if necessary. Minji said she'd prepare the children for the performance. Claire said she'd update the medical reports. Rosa said she'd keep an eye on every stranger in town. Greg said he'd talk to the guys. He said there were still people in Cross Hill who remembered what honor was. Ethan looked at them all. The butcher and his daughter, the unlicensed healer, the former sergeant with the 1,000-yard stare, the fugitive mentor of the dead prince, the street thief with a talent for shadow reconnaissance, the aristocrat with a family name and a half-empty estate, and himself, a former tutor from Portland trapped in the body of a village fool. This was his army, and it was stronger than anyone watching them could have imagined. For 10 days he worked harder than he ever had before. The morning began with Hannah's training sessions. Ray and Mark learned to move,
Finn learned to listen. Hannah discovered that Finn was blind in one eye, but his hearing made up for it. He could hear footsteps 100 meters away. He could distinguish people by the sound of their breathing. Hannah said he would make the best sentry on the entire continent. Finn's bond went from 4 to 21, a 10-day leap, because Hannah told him what no one had ever told him before, that his blindness wasn't a weakness, it was a gift. That the world had taken one of his eyes, but given him ears that could hear what sighted people couldn't. Finn cried. Once. At night. Quietly. Then he got up in the morning and asked Hannah to continue. After practice, Min-ji taught lessons, reading, writing, calligraphy. She taught each of them in her own way. She had Emma draw symbols with fire in the sand. She gave Leo maps and asked him to mark the routes. She gave Nora poems about water and asked her to copy them out. To Sam, who didn't speak, she let him sit silently beside her and guide the brush. She didn't force him to speak. She didn't pressure him. She just sat beside him. A silence that wasn't frightening. On the 48th, Sam spoke. The first word in all the 50 days Ethan had known him. He was sitting next to Min-ji, moving the brush across the paper. He was drawing a symbol, a simple one, a straight line with a curl. Min-ji said it was beautiful. Sam lifted his head. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. He said one more thing. One word. Quiet. Hoarse. Like a voice that had forgotten how to sound. Min-ji showed no surprise. She just nodded. She handed him a new sheet of paper.
Sam drew until evening. Alice sat nearby and cried silently, not out of sadness, but because her brother had spoken a word. The system chimed. Sam's affinity had risen 6 to 25. Threshold surpassed. Talent awakened. Rank awakened. Class sign inscriber. Type Moon Mirror School Sign Magic. Compatibility with mentor Min-ji Han. Complete. Min-ji stared at the screen that only she and Ethan could see. Her hands were trembling. She looked at Ethan. Her eyes were wet. She said quietly that it was impossible, that the school of the moon mirror required blood, kinship, a bloodline, that a stranger's child couldn't bear this gift. Ethan said it was possible, if the gift was unlocked not by blood, but by love. Min-ji closed her eyes. 4 out of 10. Alice's affinity had risen to 23. Almost there. Owen's affinity was 24, 1 point away from the threshold. Chloe's attachment was 22. Mark's attachment was 21. Finn's attachment was 21. Ray's attachment was 24. 1 point. Ethan counted the days and numbers. 5 days until the inspection. 6 were on the verge. 2 of them were just 1 step away, Ray and Owen. He couldn't rush them. Couldn't force them. Couldn't say, hurry up. The system sensed insincerity instantly. All he could do was keep going. Cook dinner, fix furniture, read stories, sit by the cot when someone couldn't sleep, be there, every day, every night. On the 55th day, 3 days before the inspection, Owen woke up. He was helping Ethan carry water from the stream. His leg had healed long ago. He was carrying a bucket when he suddenly stopped. He set the bucket down. He crouched. He pressed his palm against the ground, and the ground responded. A tiny sprout rose between his fingers, green, alive, with a tiny white flower at the top. Owen looked at the sprout, then at his hands, then at Ethan. His eyes were huge. Ethan smiled. He said it was a beautiful flower. 5 out of 10. Ethan rallied the whole team to prepare for the fall inspection. Sam spoke for the first time in months and awakened a talent for drawing symbols compatible with Min-ji's style. Owen awakened the talent of Earth. 5 out of 10 children have been awakened. 3 days until the inspection. 6 are approaching the threshold of awakening. Inspection day, the 58th day since Ethan's awakening in this world. The morning was clear, cold. The first frost had settled on the grass like white dust. Winter was approaching. An inspector arrived from the capital, not Moss, a man of higher rank. David Lawrence, advisor to His Majesty's Chancellery, tall, gray-haired, in a black uniform with silver trim. With him were 4 clerks, 2 guards, and a woman in a dark dress bearing the Ashcroft family crest on her chest. She wasn't hiding, she wasn't pretending. She walked openly beside the royal inspector as an equal. Ethan stood on the porch. He saw everything. He understood everything. The Ashcrofts didn't wait for the inspection to begin. They had come for the inspection. They blended in. They observed. They prepared. Iris stood at the orphanage gate, in her best dress, with the family brooch on her chest, back straight, chin up. She looked at the woman from Ashcroft as if she were an insect, a habit of the aristocracy, a useful one. Hannah stood by the fence. She wasn't carrying a weapon, but Ethan knew she had a knife hidden in her boot and another in her sleeve. Rosa was on the roof, invisible. Minji was sitting inside with the children. Sophie stood by the stove. She was cooking, because she always cooked when she was nervous. Claire stood next to Ethan, pale. Her hands glowed faintly. Healing magic. Not from healing, from anxiety. She couldn't control her gift when she was nervous. Lawrence entered the shelter. He surveyed the room, more thoroughly than Moss, for longer. He checked every bunk, every seam, every plank. He checked the food supplies. He checked the water. He checked the documents. All 10 medical reports, the deed of gift from House Valefor, the registry of awakened talents signed by Moss. He read in silence, for a long time. The woman from Ashcroft stood behind him and read as well. Then Lawrence looked up. He said he wanted to see the talents in person. Ethan nodded. He led the children out to the square in front of the orphanage. All of Cross Hill had gathered. Greg and his wife, the market vendors, the blacksmith, the tavern owner, women with children, old people, everyone. The whole town had come out. 10 children stood in a row, just like the day Moss arrived, only now they stood differently. Ray was in front, back straight, arms at his sides, the posture Hannah had taught him. Behind him was Mark, one working hand. But he stood straight, confidently. Then the rest, clean, dressed, well-fed, alive. Ethan stood before Lawrence. He said that 58 days ago he'd been given 10 children with official empty vessels status. No food, no money, no help. With a hole in the roof and 2 weeks to live based on the odds at the local bar. He said that today 10 children stood before the counselor, all alive, all healthy, and 5 of them have awakened their talents. Lawrence raised an eyebrow. He said that Moss's report listed only 1. Ethan said that things had changed since then. He turned to Emma. Emma stepped forward. A little girl, 4 years old, a burn on her cheek. She raised her hand. A flame flared up in her palm, bright, steady, stronger than the first time. She held it for 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then she gently extinguished it. She bowed, just as Minji had taught her. The crowd gasped. Lawrence didn't move. Leo stepped forward second, 7 years old, skinny, quiet. He didn't show any magic. He showed a map, drawn with charcoal on a piece of cloth, a map of all of Cross Hill, every street, every house, every alley, with marked vantage points, escape routes,
Strategic positions. Lawrence took the map. He stared at it for a long time. His hands trembled. He'd served in the army before joining the office. He understood what he was seeing. Nora came out third. She lifted water from a bucket. A transparent stream hung in the air. It curled into a spiral. Nora smiled, and the water gently drifted back down. Sam came out fourth, silently. He placed a sheet of paper in front of Lawrence. On it was a symbol, drawn with a brush. Simple,
a straight line with a curl. Lawrence touched the paper and pulled his hand away. The symbol glowed with a warm, golden light. Min-ji stood to the side, her face pale. The magic of symbols, a style that hadn't been seen in Vallenheim for 200 years. Owen was the last of the awakened to emerge. He crouched down. He pressed his palm to the ground. A sprout rose up with a flower, white in October, when nothing blooms. The crowd was silent. Lawrence was silent. The woman from Ashcroft was silent. Then Lawrence turned to Ethan. He asked quietly, "How?" Ethan replied just as he had to Moss. Fed him, dressed him, healed him, read him a bedtime story, didn't leave. Lawrence looked at him for a long time.
Then he turned to the woman from Ashcroft. He asked her if she had any comments. The woman opened her mouth, and at that moment Iris stepped forward. Her voice was steady, cold, steel hard. She said that these children were under the protection of House Valefor, that the land beneath the orphanage belonged to her family, that any attempt at removal would be regarded as an encroachment on the property of the ancient house, and that her uncle, the Earl of Valefor, at the royal court, had already been notified. The woman from Ashcroft closed her mouth. She turned pale. Iris stared at her without blinking. Iris's attachments from 28 to 40. Lawrence recorded everything, every talent, every name, every number. 5 awakened out of 10 empty vessels in 58 days, without the academy, without the order's mentors, without resources. He said he would report to His Majesty personally. He said the orphanage was passing its inspection with the highest rating. He said he would recommend granting the orphanage the status of a royal orphanage. The crowd erupted. Shouts, applause. Greg roared like a bear. Sophie jumped up and down. Claire cried openly. Hannah stood by the fence and smiled for the first time in 3 years. A real smile. Min-ji stood off to the side, and her mask finally slipped away completely. She was crying quietly, her face buried in her hands, just like Claire had that day when she saw the 26 little marks on the wall. Ethan stood in the middle of the square, surrounded by 10 children. Emma held his right hand. Leo held his left. Ray stood behind him. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. His face was calm. Calm for the first time. The system beeped 5 times in a row. Ray's affinity, 25. Threshold surpassed. Talent awakened. Rank awakened. Class guardian. Alice's affinity, 25. Threshold crossed. Talent awakened. Rank awakened. Class mirror shield. Chloe's affinity, 25. Talent awakened. Class song of the wind. Ethan stood and listened as the system chimed again and again. 3. 3 at once. 8 out of 10. He looked at Ray. The boy was staring at his hands. The outline of a shield glowed faintly on his palms. Ethereal. Golden. Guardian. Ray looked up. He looked at Ethan. And for the first time in 58 days, his lips twitched. Not a smile. Not yet, but the promise of a smile. The first snow fell on Cross Hill 3 days after the inspection, silent, white. It blanketed the roofs and roads and the fence around the shelter. Smoke curled from the shelter's chimney. Thick white smoke rose into the gray sky, smelling of firewood and broth. It was warm inside, truly warm, not from the fire in the hearth. Although the fire was burning, Emma watched it. Her little hand would rise, and the flame would respond, obediently, gently, as if the fire were a living creature and recognized its mistress. 11 people sat at the long table in the center of the room, 10 children and Ethan at the head. Greg had cobbled the table together a week ago from planks from an old sawmill, wobbly, heavy, beautiful. On the table stood a pot of stew, meat from Greg, vegetables from the market, herbs from the garden that Owen had grown behind the shelter's fence in 4 days. His talent for the earth worked quietly and persistently. Every morning he would go out and press his palms against the garden beds. By evening, onions, carrots, and greens were growing in the beds. In October, under the first snow, alive, green, Ray sat to Ethan's right.
He ate in silence. His face was calm, not stony, calm. The difference was enormous. A stony face is a mask. A calm one is a choice. Ray had chosen. His talent as a guardian showed in the little things. He could sense when one of the children was nervous, when someone was feeling unwell, when someone hadn't slept. He'd turn his head in the right direction a second before a sound was made. Hannah said he'd become the best guardian of his generation. Ray didn't answer, but he didn't look away. Leo was sitting to his left. He was drawing invisible lines on the edge of the table with his finger. Maps, routes, plans. His tactical vision kicked in on its own whenever he started thinking. Min-ji said that in a year, he'd be able to see 3 moves ahead on the battlefield. In 5 years, 10. Ethan said he hoped there wouldn't be any battlefields. Min-ji looked at him. She didn't say anything. She knew better. Nora was sitting next to Claire. Quiet, rosy-cheeked, no sign of a fever. She was playing with the water in her mug, lifting little streams and letting them fall. Claire watched her and smiled. Sam sat next to Alice. He was speaking now. Not much. Quietly. In single words. But he was speaking. His symbols on paper were getting more complex every day. Min-ji tutored him for 2 hours after their regular classes. Her face during those sessions was one Ethan had never seen before. Happy. Alice awoke on the 59th day. Her talent was called Mirror Shield. She could reflect magic aimed at her back to its source. A little 5-year-old girl who never left her brother's side and whom no one noticed. Quiet, invisible, a shield. Like Ray, only different. Ray stood before the blow. Alice deflected the blow. Chloe awoke at the same moment as Ray and Alice. Her talent was called Song of the Wind. She could speak to the air, direct its currents, hear what the wind carried from afar. During the inspection, she stood in formation and heard Bart whispering in an alley 3 blocks away. She told Ethan later. Bart had said he'd leave town in the morning. Bart left at night. Not in the morning. But he left. Mark awoke on the 60th day, quietly, without witnesses. He was repairing a stool in the corner of the hall. His left shoulder ached as always. He was working with one hand. And suddenly, the stool in his hand glowed. The wood became harder. The crack closed up. The missing nails appeared out of nowhere. The talent of the master enchanter. Things in his hands became better, stronger, more perfect. Mark sat on the floor and looked at the stool, at his one working hand. Then he smiled. Finn was the last to wake up, on the 61st day, a day after the inspection. The 10th out of 10. His talent was called Echo. He heard everything, not just sounds, intentions, lies, truth, fear, joy. Every sound carried information, and Finn read it like Min-ji read books, instantly, completely. 10 out of 10. The system chimed, long, drawn out, like a bell. Not a small one, a big one. Condition met. All 10 talents have been awakened. The bonding scale for all 10 children exceeds 25. The house's aura has expanded, a radius of 200 meters. House status, full. The house is full. Ethan sat at the table and looked at those lines. Then he closed the panel. Then he looked at the children. They were eating, laughing, jostling each other, arguing over the last piece of meat. Emma was showing Alice a tiny spark on her finger. Alice reflected it back, and the spark flew back. Both of them giggled. Leo was explaining something to Finn on a map. Finn listened with his eyes closed. Then he nodded. Ray was watching everyone. Calm, familiar, just like an older brother. Nora and Chloe sat side by side, and Nora was braiding Chloe's hair. Sam was drawing a symbol on a napkin. Owen was eating for 2. Mark was fixing the spoon that Owen had broken. He was fixing it with one hand. The spoon glowed.
Ordinary kids at an ordinary table with an ordinary dinner, except that one of them could start a fire with her palm and another could pull flowers from the frozen ground. The door opened. Claire walked in. Sophie was with her, carrying a tray of pies. Behind them was Hannah, silent. She nodded to Ethan. She sat down by the door, as always. Behind them was Min-ji, quiet, with a book under her arm. An old one, a very old one. She placed the book on the edge of the table and sat down. Iris was the last to arrive, snow on her shoulders, cheeks red from the cold. She paused in the doorway and looked around the room. A long table, 11 people, a pot of stew, a fire in the hearth, laughter, warmth. She took off her coat, hung it by the door, walked over to the table.
A plate was set out for her, the 12th. Next to it, the 13th for Claire, the 14th for Sophie, the 15th for Hannah, the 16th for Min-ji. 6 adults and 10 children. Ethan looked at the full table, at the 16 plates, at the steaming pot, at the children who, 2 months ago, had been pale with hunger and silent with fear, whom the world had called empty vessels and written off, whom no one wanted. The system displayed the growth chronicle. He opened it. Emma, 4 years old. 5-year forecast, the strongest fire mage of her generation. 10-year forecast, archmage. 20-year forecast, mythic rank, legend. Leo, 7 years old. 20-year forecast, the continent's greatest military commander. Ray, 12 years old. 20-year forecast, supreme guardian of the kingdom. And so on. 10 lines, 10 destinies. Not a single one ended in death. Not a single one ended in slavery. Each ended with a word that hadn't been in those lines before. Hero. Ethan closed the chronicle. He didn't read any further. He didn't need 20-year forecasts. He needed this very evening, this very table, these faces, this laughter. Min-ji slid a book toward him, an old one, in a leather binding, with Eastern characters on the cover. She said she'd found it among her things, that she'd kept it for 3 years, that she hadn't opened it because she was afraid, that now she'd opened it and seen. Ethan opened the book. On the first page was a portrait, drawn in ink. A man, young, wearing clothes that didn't belong to this world. Jeans, a t-shirt, sneakers. He was standing against the backdrop of a building, a large, new one, with columns and a spire. The Asterian Academy. 200 years ago. The man's face looked familiar. Ethan stared at the portrait, and his hands didn't tremble, because he knew that face. It was his father's face, the man he hadn't seen since he was 15, who had left home and never returned, who they'd searched for half a year and never found, who was presumed dead 7 years later. His father had been here, 200 years ago, in this world. He built the academy. He created the talent selection system. He divided the world into those worth saving and those who could be discarded. And someone, or something, had sent Ethan here to fix what his father had broken. The system chimed one last time, quietly, not like a bell.
Like a voice, as if someone had said a single word. Just one. Thank you. Ethan closed the book, set it on the table, looked up. 16 people at the table. Snow was falling outside the window. Hoofprints were visible on the road behind the orphanage. Fresh ones. A carriage bearing the Ashcroft coat of arms was approaching. It stopped at the gate. It lingered for a moment. It turned around. It drove away. It didn't dare to enter. The house's aura burned 200 meters away, invisible, impenetrable. A wall of warmth and love,
and the stubbornness of one man who had decided he would not leave. Ethan stood up. He picked up a mug of water because they had no wine. He looked at each of them. At Emma, with a burn on her cheek and fire in her palms. At Leo, who was no longer crying into his plate. At Ray, who for the first time in 12 years was sleeping without a knife under his pillow. At Nora, who sang while washing the dishes. At Owen, who always had seeds in his pockets. At Sam, who now spoke 3 words every day, and that was more than any speech. To Alice, who stood behind her brother like a shield. To Chloe, with a blue ribbon in her hair from Sophie.
To Mark, who fixed everything with one hand, and everything was stronger than new. To Finn, who heard the world the way no one else did. To Claire, who no longer considered herself weak. To Sophie, who no longer pretended to be a man. To Hannah, who no longer drank. To Minji, who no longer ran away. To Iris, who was no longer alone. Ethan raised his mug. He said one sentence, briefly, quietly, without fanfare. He said he was glad everyone was home. Emma tugged at his sleeve. She looked up at him. She said one word, not uncle, Dad. Ethan Reed, 27 years in one life, 20 in another. A former foster parent, a former failure, a former man who thought he was good for nothing. Now the father of 10 children whom the world called defective. Now the guardian of future heroes. Now the man backed by a family that even an empire would step aside for. He sat down. He hugged Emma with one arm. With the other, he picked up a spoon, and he began to eat. Snow was falling outside the window. The chimney was smoking. The house was full.